close your eyes. Let the noise of the day drift away. Tonight, we travel far. Farther than memory. Farther than the oldest stories. We return to an age when the world was frozen, when ice and fire shaped the earth, and when small bands of humans began the most extraordinary journey in our history. This is the story of how our ancestors crossed the icy land bridge of Beringia and stepped into a vast, unknown continent. A story of hunger and hope, of giants and shadows, of footprints left on snow that would one day become the foundation of entire civilizations. Breathe slowly and let the firelight of the Ice Age guide you. This is Han Trin Bungia, Kuok Diku Kwa Eo Bering Vao Chao Mai Kojai. Welcome to the History Sleep Channel. The world was changing. In the far reaches of the north, the winds carried a bitterness that sank into bone and marrow. The last great ice age had reached one of its peaks, and with it came an era that would test every living thing. Vast sheets of glacial ice crawled slowly across continents, carving mountains, drowning valleys, and locking rivers beneath their frozen grip. What had once been green and temperate land now lay trapped beneath endless white. The very air glittered with frost, as if the sky itself had turned to shards of glass. It was a world of giants, giant forces of nature, giant beasts, and the giant challenge of survival. The temperature dropped, not all at once, but gradually, year by year, until winters stretched like eternal nights, and summers were brief, fragile intervals of thaw. Great herds of mammoth lumbered through the tundra, their shaggy coats brushing against each other as they searched for patches of moss and sedge. Woolly rhinoceroses scraped at icy soil with their horns. Steppe bison, towering and broad-shouldered, crowded together in defensive walls of muscle against prowling predators. And predators there were. The saber-toothed cat, Smilodon, crouched low among snowdrifts, its fangs like daggers catching the weak light of a pale sun. Packs of dire wolves, larger and heavier than modern wolves, worked in unison to drive young or sick animals away from the herd. This balance of hunter and hunted was as old as life itself. But in this frozen theater, every encounter carried greater risk. Every mistake meant death. Yet this was not only a story of animals. At the margins of this immense cold, in Siberia, small groups of humans endured as well. They were wrapped in furs stitched from the hides of reindeer and musk ox. Their hands carried spears tipped with stone blades, carefully chipped to lethal sharpness. Around communal fires, their breath rose in clouds as they shared meat, warmth, and stories. These people had not yet dreamed of continents beyond their horizon. For now, their struggle was immediate, tied to each hunt, each storm, each fragile season of growth. The earth beneath them was transforming. Glaciers locked away unimaginable amounts of water, lowering sea levels across the globe. What today would be ocean was then exposed as bare, windswept steppe. The continents of Asia and North America, separated now by the Bering Strait, were instead connected by a wide corridor of land, a bridge of survival waiting for footsteps that had not yet come. This land bridge was not entirely a frozen wasteland. It was a patchwork of tundra and grassland, dotted with hardy shrubs. Herds moved across it seasonally, and one day humans would follow. But that moment had not yet arrived. The climate ruled all. Storms rolled in from the Arctic, sculpting the snow into ridges like frozen waves. Night skies burned with auroras, green and purple curtains of light dancing across the darkness, a spectacle both terrifying and mesmerizing. For the humans watching from their camps, these skies were omens, reminders that the world was larger than they could understand, that unseen powers dictated whether they lived or died. Still, even here, life found a way. Fire crackled in shallow pits dug beneath the snow. Bones of mammoths were arranged into circular frames, covered with hides, creating shelters against the wind. Needles made from bone-stitched garments tight, sealing in warmth. Children learned quickly to tread carefully across ice, to help with scraping hides, to listen for the distant thunder of migrating herds. Survival was not just the work of hunters, it was the work of everyone. And occasionally, the land gave back a kind of testimony. In the permafrost, creatures that had fallen, whether by predator's fang, thin ice, or sheer exhaustion, were preserved in strange stillness. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would find them, frozen mammoths with skin intact, their stomachs still holding half-digested grass, as though they had laid down only yesterday. These remnants tell us today just how brutal and immediate death could be, and how swiftly the cold could turn the living into relics. In such a world, every day carried a quiet tension. Hunters watched the horizon not only for prey, but for the signs of storm. A sudden blizzard could bury a camp, wipe away tracks, silence the sound of movement. Families knew that food might run out before the season turned, that children might not survive their first winters. Even the strong carried scars from frostbite or the teeth of predators. There was no certainty except the rhythm of the ice. Yet, among the people, there was also hope. A stubborn determination, as resilient as the lichen clinging to rock. They learned to read the world in ways modern eyes might miss. The angle of snowdrifts as signs of wind direction, the subtle cracks in ice warning of thin ground, the migration of birds heralding the return of scarce warmth. Knowledge was survival, passed down not through writing, but through memory and tale, recited around the fire until every child could repeat it. The Great Freeze was not simply an enemy. It was a teacher, harsh and uncompromising, but one that shaped the minds and bodies of those who endured it. Humans grew tougher, more ingenious. They sharpened tools, learned to carve bone and ivory into new forms, experimented with trapping, fishing, and storing food. Their societies, though small, began to adapt to a rhythm of movement, following herds in patterns that crossed rivers, valleys, and the edges of frozen seas. All of this set the stage for what was to come. For though they did not yet know it, the people of Siberia were poised on the edge of a journey unlike any before in human history. Beyond the horizon, across a windswept expanse of exposed land, lay a continent untouched by human feet. It would take generations, shifting climates, and countless risks before they crossed into that new world. But the seeds of that migration were already sown here, in the relentless testing ground of the Ice Age North. The Great Freeze had begun, and with it, the shaping of destiny. The hunters of the North lived at the edge of existence, between cold sky and frozen earth. They were not many in number, small bands of families scattered across the vast Siberian tundra. But their resilience was immense. Every day was a calculation of risk and reward, every decision balanced against the thin margin between survival and starvation. Their camps were humble but ingenious. Shelters rose from mammoth bones, arranged in circles and covered with stitched hides, forming domes that trapped heat and resisted wind. In summer, Lighter tents of reindeer skin could be taken down and carried across the steppes. Smoke from fires drifted upward, mingling with the eternal gray sky, carrying the scent of roasted meat and burning fat. Life revolved around the hunt. The men and women who carried spears were not merely providers, they were lifelines, the point of contact between human need and the wild abundance of beasts. Their prey was vast. Herds of caribou streaming across open ground, woolly rhinoceroses moving with ponderous power, steppe bison whose horns gleamed in the sun. Each hunt required coordination, patience, and courage. A single mistake could scatter the herd and waste precious energy. The hunters worked with a quiet rhythm. They tracked footprints in the snow, studied the bent stalks of frozen grass, listened to the calls of distant birds that often followed herds. At dawn, when the frost still clung heavy to the earth, they would crouch in silence, waiting for the right moment. Then, with cries that echoed across the tundra, they would surge forward, spears poised, hearts hammering against their ribs. Tools were their allies. Stone flakes sharpened to razor edges, hafted onto wooden shafts, gave them reach and lethality. Some spears were designed to be thrown with the aid of a spear thrower, an extension of the arm that sent the weapon hurtling with deadly force. Bone and ivory were carved into needles, fish hooks, and barbed points. Their toolkit was small, but in skilled hands, it was enough to bring down giants. Not every hunt ended in triumph. A charging bison could gore a hunter, tossing him into the air like a rag. A rhinoceros could shatter a spear with a single sweep of its horn. Even the act of butchering a mammoth tested endurance. Hours of work in freezing wind, stripping hide, cracking bones for marrow, carving meat into strips to dry or freeze for later. The blood steamed in the cold, staining snow red. But when the hunt succeeded, it was a celebration. Fires blazed brighter, bellies filled, songs carried through the night. Meat was roasted fresh for immediate feasting, while the rest was carefully preserved. Fat was rendered into fuel for lamps. Bones became tools, ornaments, even toys for children. Hide became clothing, stitched tight against the cold. Nothing was wasted. In this land, waste was death. We know these details not only through imagination, but through discovery. Archaeological sites across Siberia preserve rings of mammoth bones that once supported shelters. Charred hearths still hold the ash of ancient fires. Stone blades lie scattered where hunters dropped them, their edges dulled from work. Even spear points found embedded in animal bones tell the story of desperate hunts, the clash of human determination against prehistoric might. These fragments, silent in the earth, give voice to the hunter's ingenuity. The social fabric of these groups was tight-knit. Around the fire, elders recounted stories, tales of hunts long past, of spirits that guarded the land, of ancestors who watched from the stars. These narratives were more than entertainment. They were survival guides encoded in myth, passing down lessons of where to travel, when to hunt, which animals were dangerous. Children absorbed them, eyes wide, repeating chants until memory became tradition. Hunting was never a solitary act. It was communal, binding people together in cooperation. Women often drove animals into ambushes or finished off wounded prey. They gathered roots, berries, and herbs when the land allowed. Children learned to snare hares, to fish beneath the ice, to scrape hides. Every hand had purpose, every person a role. Still, fear was a constant companion. The land offered no guarantees. Storms could scatter herds or bury them beneath snow. A sudden thaw might collapse river ice, swallowing hunters whole. Predators lurked always, packs of dire wolves trailing the hunters as closely as they trailed the herds. There are traces of this danger preserved in the fossil record. Bison skeletons with puncture wounds from wolf fangs, mammoth bones gnawed by saber-toothed cats. The hunters knew they were not the only predators in this world. Sometimes, even their own remains joined the frozen soil. A fall through ice, a wound that festered, an unlucky encounter with claws, all could end in death. In rare cases, the permafrost preserved their bodies too. Archaeologists have uncovered burials where red ochre was sprinkled over the dead, suggesting ritual and reverence. Grave goods, tools, ornaments, even the teeth of animals, were placed alongside, reminders that even in harshness, these people carried a sense of meaning, a recognition of the sacred in life and death. To modern eyes, their existence seems impossibly hard, yet to them, it was the only world. They did not despair the cold, they mastered it. They did not curse the beasts, they honored them. Their lives were woven into the tundra's rhythm, as inseparable from it as the wind itself. When we imagine the hunters of the north, we might picture them as shadows against the snow, lean figures in fur, moving with deliberate grace, eyes narrowed against the sting of ice. But they were more than silhouettes. They laughed, argued, fell in love, and raised children. They celebrated survival as victory. They saw beauty in auroras across the sky, in the spark of fire on dark nights, in the rhythm of drums carved from skin and bone. Every choice they made was shaped by necessity. Where to camp, when to move, which herds to follow, all decisions carried weight. And slowly, over generations, these choices nudged them closer to a horizon they could not yet see. For though they hunted the familiar beasts of Siberia, change loomed ahead. Herds would shift, climates would fluctuate, and the path of survival would one day lead them across the land bridge into a continent waiting silently in the dark. For now, though, the hunters of the north thrived in the only world they knew. They were masters of adaptation, bound by fire, spear, and community. Their footprints pressed into the frozen ground told of endurance, of lives carved from ice and blood. And each print, faint though it seemed, was a step toward history. Across the frozen steppes, the rhythm of survival was dictated not by the hunters themselves, but by the great herds that moved like rivers of flesh and bone across the land. These animals, caribou, mammoth, steppe bison, were the heartbeat of the north. To follow them was to follow life itself. When the first hints of spring touched the tundra, the air softened ever so slightly, and the snow crust cracked underfoot. Caribou began their restless migrations, hooves clicking like drums on the frozen ground. They moved in lines that stretched beyond sight, their bodies forming waves of gray and white against the horizon. The hunters watched them with hungry eyes. Each caribou represented meat, hide, sinew, bone, resources enough to sustain a family. But caribou were not the only prize. Mammoths, towering and slow-moving, trampled through the melting snow in search of grasses. To follow a herd of mammoths was to follow a walking storehouse of life, tons of meat, acres of hide, tusks that could be carved into tools and ornaments. Yet the very scale of the animal made the hunt dangerous. A panicked mammoth could crush a hunter beneath its feet. A herd could stampede and scatter in chaos. Only when conditions favored them did the people dare to attempt such hunts. Steppe bison, too, carved their trails across the land. Larger and more aggressive than the modern bison, these animals gathered in dense groups, their horns lowered, their eyes sharp with suspicion. To hunt them meant cunning, teamwork, and sometimes sacrifice. The people knew this. They had stories of ancestors trampled in the snow, of hunts gone wrong. Yet still they followed, because where the herds went, food went, and without food, there could be no survival. The pursuit of herds was not random wandering. It was guided by knowledge passed through generations. Hunters knew the lay of valleys where snow melted early, the river crossings where caribou gathered, the sheltered ridges where mammoths paused to graze. This knowledge was a kind of living map, etched into memory, carried in story and song. It guided entire families across hundreds of miles of bleak terrain, where landmarks were scarce and mistakes were costly. Movement was life, but it was also risk. To follow the herds meant abandoning the security of campfires, striking out into the uncertain wilderness. Women packed hides and tools, children carried bundles of dried meat, elders leaned on carved sticks as they trudged alongside. Each migration tested the group's endurance. Storms could sweep in suddenly, blinding the hunters in a curtain of snow. Ice could crack beneath their feet, plunging them into freezing water. Predators shadowed the herds as well, watching for weakness, sometimes turning their eyes from prey to people. The evidence of these journeys lingers even now. Archaeologists uncover scattered encampments along ancient migration corridors, fire pits blackened with soot, flakes of stone where tools were sharpened, butchered bones cracked for marrow. In some cases, mammoth bones bear the unmistakable scars of human stone blades, proving that these massive creatures were not just scavenged, but hunted outright. These fragments in the earth confirm what the stories of survival already whisper, that following the herds was more than strategy, it was necessity. The chase itself was a spectacle. Hunters would fan out, working in silence, moving downwind so as not to betray their scent. They watched for the young, the weak, the isolated. Sometimes they drove animals into natural traps, bogs, ravines, or onto unstable ice. A sudden shout, a rain of spears, the thundering panic of hooves. It was chaos distilled into moments. In that chaos, life and death were decided. Not all hunts were triumphs. A wounded animal might escape, leaving the hunters exhausted and empty-handed. Sometimes, hunters themselves fell, gored by horns, crushed by hooves. In rare cases, their bodies too were left behind, and in frozen soil, some of those bodies have endured. Modern forensic analysis reveals broken bones, deep puncture wounds, even traces of ancient infections. These grim testimonies remind us that following the herds was no game of chance. It was a razor's edge of survival, and yet, for all the danger, there was also abundance. A successful hunt meant days, even weeks of security. Around fires, families feasted, laughter mixing with the crackle of flames. Children chewed roasted marrow. Women stitched fresh hides into new garments. Men resharpened spears. The community swelled with life after each victory. Songs celebrated the bravery of hunters. Dances mimicked the movements of animals. Myths wove the creatures into the tapestry of spirit and meaning. These myths were not idle. They bound the people to the herds in a relationship of respect as well as necessity. Mammoths might be honored as ancient beings, guardians of the tundra. Caribou were seen as gifts from the spirits, returning each season to feed those who honored them. Bison carried the strength of the earth in their bodies, strength that could be shared if hunted with care. This worldview turned the chase into ritual, giving structure and dignity to the cycle of life and death. Following the herds shaped not only survival, but destiny. The routes traced by caribou and mammoths led ever closer to the exposed lands of Beringia, the great land bridge that connected continents. Generation after generation, people moved in step with the animals, their camps drifting eastward. They did not yet think of themselves as migrants, but as followers of food. Yet each step brought them nearer to new horizons, to territories untouched by human feet, to a future that stretched across an entire hemisphere. At times, the pursuit pressed the people into silence, into the bone-deep weariness of endless travel. Their footprints stretched behind them in lines across the snow, sometimes fading into nothing as winds erased the trail. But still they walked, for to stop was to die, and to die without following the herds was to betray the rhythm of the world. In the end, these hunters did not merely chase animals, they mirrored them. They became part of the Great Migration, bound to the movements of the land, the seasons, the cycles of ice and thaw. And through this relentless pursuit, they carried humanity step by step toward the unknown. The land was never still. Though the world seemed locked in an eternal freeze, beneath the crust of ice, the earth was restless. Glaciers, thick as mountains, moved with glacial patience, grinding stone into powder, reshaping valleys and rivers. At the same time, deep fissures in the ground hissed with steam, and volcanoes rumbled in the distance. This was a land not only of ice, but of fire, a paradox of frozen silence and sudden violence. The hunters who followed the herds knew this landscape well. They saw the ice cliffs calve without warning, sending avalanches of frozen rock tumbling into rivers. They heard the groan of glaciers as they inched forward, splitting the earth with the weight of ages. Sometimes, the very air quivered with the roar of distant eruptions. In the far north, the ground shook, and columns of ash rose high, blotting out the sun for days. To live in such a place required constant vigilance. Streams that seemed frozen solid could break apart without warning, releasing torrents of meltwater. Rivers swelled, surged, and then froze again overnight, trapping fish in crystal prisons. Families learned to move quickly when the ground trembled, to abandon camps if smoke thickened the horizon. For them, the earth was alive, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, always unpredictable. Volcanoes were both a curse and a strange blessing. Their eruptions spread devastation, coating the land in ash, killing plants and choking rivers. But when seasons passed and the ash settled, grasses returned richer, the soil darker and more fertile. Herds eventually drifted back to graze, and the hunters followed, careful not to forget the fury that had once burned there. In their stories, fire was given a spirit's name, a reminder of both destruction and rebirth. The ice itself was no less fearsome. In summer, torrents of meltwater carved paths through valleys, filling lowlands with temporary lakes. When these lakes burst their icy dams, floods swept across the plains, dragging trees, animals, and even people into their rush. Archaeologists today can still trace the scars of such floods. Ancient channels carved deep into the Siberian soil, enormous ripple marks left behind like the fingerprints of vanished waters. These landscapes tell us that what seemed like endless ice could, in a single violent season, turn into raging rivers. The people adapted as best they could. Camps were never fixed for long. Mobility was survival. Hunters carried their shelters on long poles. Women stitched hides with bone needles during journeys. Children walked beside the herds, learning from every step. At night, fire was coaxed from flint and tinder, guarded against the howling wind. To the people, fire was not just warmth. It was a defiance of the cold and a gift against the darkness. It is likely that volcanic glass, obsidian, found its way into their hands as well. Archaeological digs show that prehistoric peoples prized obsidian for its razor-sharp edges, sharper even than flint. A single shard could cut flesh cleanly, a tool of both life and death. The presence of obsidian tools, far from volcanic regions, tells us that people carried or traded these treasures across vast distances. In this way, fire's fury was transformed into a hunter's ally, but not every gift of fire was benign. When eruptions clouded the skies, temperatures dropped further still. Ash fell like black snow, choking lungs, coating the hides of animals. In some layers of permafrost, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of animals with ash trapped in their airways, suffocated by a world turned toxic. These remnants, frozen for millennia, remind us how sudden and merciless nature could be. Imagine the hunters watching the horizon, a wall of darkness rising, lightning crackling inside the ash cloud, the sun dimmed to a red smear. For them, such sights were omens. The spirits of the earth were speaking, sometimes in whispers of auroras, sometimes in the roar of mountains splitting open. And the people listened, weaving these terrifying spectacles into their myths. They told stories of fire serpents that lived beneath the ground, of angry gods shaking the earth, of ancestors who had to appease the spirits with ritual. The land of ice and fire was not simply backdrop. It was a crucible that shaped humanity. To endure it required ingenuity. Hunters sought safer paths along ridges when valleys flooded. They built stronger shelters, reinforced with mammoth bones, when storms grew harsher. They timed their movements not only by the stars and herds, but by the earth itself, waiting for floods to subside, for ash to settle, for glaciers to retreat. Even death bore witness to these struggles. In some permafrost sites, the bodies of ancient animals lie entombed, their flesh seared on one side, frozen on the other, a haunting testament to fire meeting ice. Forensic studies of these remains reveal trauma, bones fractured by floods, lungs filled with ash. Each discovery reads like a page torn from the story of catastrophe, echoing the dangers the hunters themselves once faced. Yet, for all the peril, there was also wonder. Children watched in awe as geysers spouted plumes of steam into the sky. Hunters used the silhouettes of volcanoes as landmarks in their journeys. When the auroras rippled above smoke-darkened skies, it seemed as though fire and ice danced together, a spectacle no myth could fully explain. This paradoxical land demanded resilience, but it also gifted memory. The landscapes carved by glaciers, the valleys reshaped by floods, the obsidian tools chipped from volcanic glass, all these became part of the legacy carried forward by those who survived. They were not merely wanderers in a wasteland. They were witnesses to the raw power of a planet still forming itself. And slowly, this harsh training prepared them for greater trials ahead. If they could endure a land that burned and froze in the same breath, what could they not endure? Step by step, they pressed onward, following herds, following rivers, following the shifting promise of survival. For the hunters of the north, the land of ice and fire was more than terrain. It was destiny's forge. The crucible that tested them would one day deliver them across new horizons, into a continent waiting unseen across the frozen bridge. The world was shifting again. Seasons lengthened, and the pulse of ice and thaw grew more unpredictable. Herds that once roamed familiar valleys began to wander farther east, pressing against the edge of a new horizon. The hunters followed, as they always had, their steps measured by hunger and instinct. But now, what lay ahead was no longer just another stretch of tundra. It was something different, a vast corridor of land stretching into the distance, a bridge of earth between worlds. The people could not have known its significance in the terms we use today. To them, it was simply the next place the herds had gone. Where the mammoths and caribou moved, they must follow. But in truth, this was Beringia, the exposed landmass that connected Siberia and Alaska during the depths of the Ice Age. Sea levels had fallen by more than 100 meters, locking water away in glaciers. What is now a strait of icy ocean was then a broad plain of windswept grass, stretching for hundreds of miles. From the high ridges of Siberia, hunters gazed out and saw the land continuing beyond the horizon, not broken by sea, but rolling in muted hills and valleys. To them, it must have seemed a natural extension of their world, another hunting ground to be tested, another step in the pursuit of survival. Crossing was not a single event, but a process that spanned generations. Small groups probed forward, perhaps in summer, when conditions softened, when rivers thinned, and herds grew restless. They built temporary camps along the way, lighting fires against the endless night. At first, they may have thought of it only as an extension of their seasonal wanderings. But with each journey, with each new trail marked by footprints and campfire ash, the people edged deeper into the unknown. The crossing beckoned in silence. There were no markers, no guides, only the wind, the stars, and the herds themselves. Children trudged beside their parents, wrapped in furs, eyes wide at the new land stretching outward. Hunters carried spears over their shoulders, wary of predators that might prowl even here. Women balanced infants in hide slings, their breath frosting in the air as they sang low songs to keep fear at bay. Archaeological evidence suggests that people lingered in Beringia for centuries, perhaps millennia, before pressing further south. Hearths found in ancient soils reveal layers of ash built up over long occupations. Stone tools chipped from local rock tell us that families lived here season after season, shaping their lives around what the land provided. Forensic traces in animal bones suggest that even in this liminal space, hunting was fierce. Mammoth ribs pierced by stone spear points, caribou skeletons stripped with precision cuts. These discoveries remind us that the crossing was not just passage, but habitation. Beringia itself was unlike the world they had left. It was not entirely icebound, but a mosaic of grassland, shrub, and tundra. Summers brought wildflowers that splashed color across the plain. Rivers cut channels through the land, swelling with meltwater, teeming with fish. Birds swarmed overhead in great migrations, their calls filling the air. For a people used to scarcity, Beringia offered both opportunity and danger, yet danger was never far. Winter winds screamed across the open ground, scouring flesh with ice. Herds could vanish in storms, leaving hunters stranded. Wolves and cave lions stalked the same prey, their shadows flickering at the edge of firelight. In some places, the ground itself betrayed them. Thin ice caving underfoot, bogs sucking at the legs of man and beast alike. Survival here was no less uncertain than in Siberia, and still, the crossing called. There was something in the horizon itself that beckoned, the sense of a path that had no end, of land that stretched farther than anyone had ever known. Perhaps the people told stories about what lay beyond. New spirits, new animals, lands where the sky touched the earth. In the flicker of firelight, myths may have been born, weaving together the mystery of what lay ahead with the memory of what was left behind. Sometimes, the land itself preserved the echoes of their journeys. In the permafrost of Alaska and Siberia, ancient campsites have been discovered, their outlines still visible. Rings of stones that once held down tent hides, fire pits filled with charcoal, and bones cracked open for marrow. In a few rare cases, the bones of dogs appear, suggesting that these early hunters brought companions with them, animals that shared both labor and loyalty. Such finds blur the line between myth and history, grounding the story of the crossing in traces left beneath the frozen soil. It is tempting to imagine one family, one moment, one decisive step onto this new land. But the truth is more subtle. The crossing was not a march, but a drift, a gradual expansion of territory, a slow stitching together of camps across an immense plain. Some groups may have ventured forward only to return when storms grew harsh. Others stayed, establishing themselves in the liminal space of Beringia for generations. And still others pressed onward, carried by hunger, curiosity, or necessity into the heart of a new continent. The people themselves could not have known what they were doing, that they were the first humans to set foot in the Americas, that their descendants would one day span from the Arctic Circle to the southern tip of South America. To them, it was survival, nothing more. And yet, in that survival was the seed of destiny. The crossing beckoned because the herds beckoned, because hunger beckoned, because life itself urged them forward. In their quiet determination, in their willingness to follow the path wherever it led, they set in motion one of the greatest migrations in human history. For now, they did not think of themselves as discoverers. They were families seeking food, hunters following prey, children chasing the warmth of firelight. But step by step, footprint by footprint, they moved across the land bridge, writing the first chapter of humanity in a new world. And in the silence of Beringia, under the crackling of fire and the howl of wind, the future waited. The first footsteps on Beringia's frozen ground were not taken in triumph. They were taken in silence, in weariness, in the slow rhythm of families on the move. Hunters, women, children, elders, all pressed forward across the vast expanse, their boots of hide crunching against permafrost that rang like stone. Each step was a claim, though they did not know it. Every print pressed into the snow was an imprint of survival, the beginnings of a human trail across a continent that had never known them before. The wind quickly erased their paths, but beneath the surface, some footprints lingered, hardened in mud that later froze. Tens of thousands of years later, archaeologists would find such traces in the Americas, human steps preserved alongside those of giant ground sloths and mammoths, telling us that these first wanderers truly walked here. The families carried their world with them. Mammoth hide shelters packed on poles, tools napped from flint, bundles of dried meat wrapped in sinew. Infants were strapped to mothers' backs, wrapped in furs. Children dragged sleds made from bent branches. Dogs padded at the edges of the group, their noses to the wind, sensing danger before human ears could catch it. They were not armies, not explorers. They were simply people moving forward because to remain behind meant hunger. Nights were spent huddled in circles of firelight. The land was vast, and the silence immense, broken only by the cry of wolves or the cracking of ice in the distance. Around the flames, elders told stories to chase away fear. They spoke of ancestors who had always followed the herds, of spirits who walked beside them, invisible but present in the hiss of snow and the glow of the auroras. For the children, these stories gave meaning to the endless march. For the adults, they were reminders that they were not alone. The dangers were real and constant. Thin ice swallowed hunters who ventured too close to rivers. Winds scoured the skin raw, leaving burns that never healed. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Some nights, the storm winds grew so strong that entire shelters were ripped from the earth and flung into the dark. In such times, survival hung by the thinnest thread, and sometimes death walked among them. A fall, a wound from a hunt, an illness that lingered, any of these could take a life. Burials were simple, yet poignant. A shallow pit in frozen soil, a body wrapped in hide, a sprinkle of red ochre from powdered stone. In rare cases, the frozen ground preserved entire bodies, flesh intact, eyes closed as if merely sleeping. Archaeologists today marvel at such finds. The frozen child buried with beads, the hunter still wearing fur garments stitched with bone needles. These remnants remind us that the footsteps were not only of the living, but also of the dead, carried forward in memory. To walk upon frozen ground was to walk upon a threshold. Behind them lay the familiar valleys of Siberia, the routes traced by generations of ancestors. Ahead stretched land no human had mapped, dotted with strange ridges and frozen rivers, endless horizons where no campfires yet burned. For the first time, humanity was stepping beyond its known world. Still, the daily rhythm of life did not change. Women scraped hides by the fire, their hands stiff with cold. Hunters checked spear points, retied sinew bindings, prepared for the next pursuit. Children learned to weave grasses into mats, to carve small toys from ivory, to mimic the actions of adults. Even in migration, life persisted, an unbroken chain of lessons, gestures, and traditions passed on as naturally as breath. The herds remained their compass. Mammoths plowed paths through snow, revealing patches of grass. Caribou shifted with the seasons, guiding the people eastward. Sometimes the hunters trailed them for weeks, moving slowly across the plain, pausing only when storms forced rest. Other times, herds vanished into valleys, and the hunters scouted desperately, knowing that to lose the animals was to risk everything. There were moments of quiet wonder, too. Children watched the sky blaze with northern lights, the green and violet curtains swaying above the black horizon. Hunters stood still as herds of bison thundered past, the earth shaking under thousands of hooves. At river crossings, the people saw fish swarming in schools so dense they turned the water silver. These moments were reminders that the land was not only cruel, it was also abundant, rich with gifts for those who endured. Traces of their camps still lie buried in the soil of Alaska and Siberia. Rings of stones mark where tents once stood. Ash still darkens the earth where fires burned. In some places, tools chipped from local stone reveal that families paused long enough to work the land itself. And in certain deposits, Footprints preserved in ancient mud tell the story of a mother and child walking together, their steps pressed side by side. A tender, fleeting moment turned eternal in the fossil record. Forensic studies of bones left behind also tell us of the trials of this crossing. A mammoth rib pierced with a stone point shows where hunters struck and where danger was faced. Human skeletons bear the marks of stress, worn joints from long travel, broken bones healed and rehealed, evidence of lives lived under relentless strain. These details, uncovered millennia later, confirm what the story already suggests, that each step on frozen ground carried with it weight, hardship, and endurance. Still, hope pressed them forward. The fire in their shelters, the warmth of family, the memory of successful hunts, these were sparks that kept despair at bay. Even as storms howled and the land stretched on without end, the people carried within them the knowledge that survival was possible, that the world could be endured, step after frozen step. And so, their footprints multiplied. Across the plains of Beringia, across river valleys and wind-scoured ridges, they moved like shadows etched against snow. Their trails wove into the land itself, invisible to the eye, but indelible in destiny. For in those footsteps lay the promise of the future, the first human marks upon a continent that awaited them in silence. What began as mere survival was becoming something more, the unfolding of a journey that would one day cover the breadth of the Americas. Each step upon frozen ground was a step into history, into the shaping of a new human story that would echo for millennia. Death was never far on the ice. It walked beside the people, silent as shadow, waiting in the storms, the hunts, the thin crust of ice over rivers. Every step carried the weight of danger, and every family knew that loss might strike without warning. To live in this world was to live under the constant presence of death's hand. The first signs were often subtle. A cough that lingered too long, a limp that worsened after a hunt, a child's fever that no fire could banish. In the cold, small illnesses grew large, and wounds festered quickly. Frostbite stole fingers and toes. Starvation hollowed out eyes and skin. Sometimes it was the weather itself that claimed them, storms that buried shelters in snow, or sudden thaws that drowned camps in floods of icy water. When death came, the people did not ignore it. They faced it with ritual, with reverence, with an understanding that life and death were two sides of the same journey. Graves were dug where the ground allowed, shallow pits hacked from frozen earth. Bodies were wrapped in hides, red ochre sprinkled upon them like the blessing of blood. Tools, beads, or animal teeth were sometimes placed alongside, as though the departed might need them beyond the horizon of life. Archaeologists have found such burials across Siberia and Alaska. In one grave, a child rests with ivory beads sewn into clothing, a care that speaks of love even in grief. In another, two hunters lie side by side, ochre staining their bones red, stone points beside them like weapons carried into the afterlife. These discoveries whisper that the people of the North did not abandon their dead. They carried them forward in memory, leaving behind signs we can still read tens of thousands of years later. But not every death could be honored with ritual. Sometimes bodies were lost to the wilderness, swallowed by bogs, dragged away by predators, entombed in collapsing ice. The permafrost has preserved some of these in haunting detail. Frozen faces still bear strands of hair. Hands still clutch tools. Forensic analysis shows fractured skulls, shattered ribs, wounds that tell of hunts gone wrong. These echoes of pain remind us that survival was not guaranteed, and that for each family who pressed onward, others were left behind. To the living, the loss of even one person was heavy. Small groups could not spare hands. A fallen hunter meant fewer spears at the chase. A mother lost meant children orphaned, a gap in the fabric of community. Elders carried knowledge of migration paths, of fire-making, of ritual. Their deaths were wounds not only to the heart, but to memory itself. In such small societies, every absence left a silence too wide to fill. And yet, grief itself became ritual. Around the fire, stories of the lost were retold. Children learned to speak their names, to honor their spirits with song. In some groups, the dead were imagined as watching from the auroras above, their souls dancing in the sky. In others, they were said to travel beneath the ground, walking paths parallel to the living. These beliefs did not erase pain, but they gave shape to it, a framework for mourning that made endurance possible. There were moments when death came not singly, but in waves. Harsh winters claimed multiple lives. Hunts ended in disaster, leaving survivors to carry back broken news. Entire camps could vanish to storm or flood. In those times, the survivors bore scars deeper than the body. Trauma etched itself into memory, passed on as cautionary tales to future generations. Forensic studies of skeletal remains sometimes reveal evidence of malnutrition across multiple individuals, the thin lines in bones showing years of hunger that affected whole communities. These are silent records of seasons when shadows of death fell long upon the land. And yet, even death carried lessons. Hunters examined the bodies of fallen prey and of their own dead, learning from wounds. A spear point lodged in a mammoth rib told them how deep to aim. A broken bone poorly set became a warning of what not to do. In this way, the dead became teachers, their bodies a final gift of knowledge. Children, too, grew up in the shadow of death. They saw burials, they heard the wailing songs, they felt the absence when a parent or sibling did not return. But they also absorbed resilience. They learned that grief could be carried, that life pressed forward despite loss. In time, they would take their own steps across the ice, carrying with them not only tools and skills, but also the memory of those who had fallen. The shadow of death did not diminish the spirit of the people. It sharpened it. Each hunt was undertaken with awareness of risk. Each fire was cherished for its fragile flame. Each birth was a triumph, a defiance against the odds. Death walked among them, but life danced in spite of it. Modern excavations give us haunting glimpses of these realities. At certain sites, entire clusters of bones suggest family groups buried together, perhaps after catastrophe. Analysis of tooth enamel reveals stress during childhood, likely from famine. Fragments of red ochre cling stubbornly to bones, echoing rituals performed tens of millennia ago. These small details, uncovered grain by grain, tell us that the shadows of death were not faceless. They were woven into every moment of life. But beyond sorrow, there was resilience. Even after funerals by firelight, even after bodies lowered into icy soil, the people rose and moved on. Their survival demanded it. Herds did not pause for grief. Predators did not give respite. Storms did not wait. To stop was to surrender. So families carried their dead in memory, their names spoken on the wind, and stepped once more into the snow. Perhaps that is why their journey succeeded. For though death stalked them at every turn, the people did not yield. They faced loss, absorbed it, and still pressed forward. Their shadows stretched across the land bridge, across the plains of Berinia, into a continent unmarked by human hand. Each death was a reminder of fragility, but also a measure of strength. For still they walked, still they endured. The shadows of death were long, but the fire of life burned longer. The plains were never empty. To the herds that crossed them, to the hunters who followed, the land seemed vast and open. But always, in the shadows, predators waited. They moved silently across the snow, their eyes glinting in pale light, their bodies lean and powerful. For every herd of bison, for every group of mammoths, for every band of people, there were hunters of another kind. The dire wolf was among the most feared. Larger and heavier than wolves of our age, with jaws built to crush bone, they hunted in coordinated packs. At dusk, their howls rolled across the plains, a chorus that raised the hair on human necks. The people knew that where the howls gathered, danger was near. Dire wolves could trail a herd for days, waiting for weakness. They were patient, relentless, striking when snow was deep and prey slowed. A single pack might number 30, surrounding, harrying, wearing down their victims until escape was impossible. Humans, too, sometimes fell into their sights. Archaeological evidence suggests encounters were frequent. Dire wolf bones are found alongside human tools, sometimes bearing cut marks that hint at both conflict and scavenging. In certain sites, wolf bones show healed fractures, perhaps from clashes with spears. These marks in bone are silent witnesses to the struggle between predator and human, two species locked in the same pursuit of survival. But dire wolves were not alone. In the shadows of rocky outcrops, cave lions prowled, larger than modern lions, their frames built for power and ambush. They hunted in smaller groups, striking from concealment. A cave lion leaping into a herd of bison was a force of chaos. Bodies scattering, snow flying, claws and teeth flashing in the storm of movement. For people traveling the plains, the sight of a lion's silhouette on a ridge was a warning to stay close to the fire. Then there was the most formidable of all, the saber-toothed cat. Smilodon was a predator, unlike any other, with fangs as long as a man's hand, built not for slashing, but for piercing deep into the necks of prey. It was muscular, stocky, a sprinter rather than a chaser. Smilodon waited in silence, hidden among snowdrifts or behind ridges, before exploding forward in sudden violence. To see one was rare. To survive its ambush was rarer still. Fossils of Smilodon reveal not only their terrifying anatomy, but also their lives. Some show healed injuries, suggesting they lived in groups where others helped feed the wounded. Others bear the marks of desperate hunts, broken fangs, fractured jaws. A few bones even show human stone points lodged within, silent testimony that these cats sometimes became the hunted instead of the hunter. Such evidence connects us across time to moments of blood and fear, when spear and fang collided on the frozen plains. For the people, predators were constant companions. They trailed the herds just as humans did, waiting for opportunity. Hunters had to watch the shadows, not only for their prey, but for rivals. A bison brought down by spears might attract wolves before it could be butchered. Mammoth carcasses became battlefields, with men, wolves, and cats circling in tense standoffs. Sometimes humans drove predators away with fire and shouting. Other times, they were forced to abandon their kill, retreating into the night as eyes glowed in the darkness. The fires at camp became more than warmth. They were protection. Flames kept predators at bay. The flicker of light, a boundary between safety and danger. Children learned to feed the fire, to keep it alive through the night. The sight of wolf eyes gleaming at the edge of firelight became a memory burned into every survivor, a reminder that vigilance was as vital as food. Not all encounters ended in violence. Sometimes people scavenged the kills of predators, taking what remained after wolves or cats had fed. Archaeological sites reveal bones marked both by carnivore teeth and by human stone tools, layered traces of two hunters sharing the same carcass. To modern eyes, it seems brutal. To the people, it was survival. Every scrap of marrow, every strip of hide, every fragment of fat mattered. Predators shaped human behavior. Camps were built near ridges for vantage, or near rivers where animals hesitated to cross. Scouts walked ahead of the group, not only watching for prey, but listening for silence. The sudden hush of birds that meant something lurked nearby. Weapons were kept close, even during rest. Children were taught early to read tracks, the round print of a wolf, the deep claw marks of a lion, the broad pad of a saber-tooth. These skills meant the difference between safety and disaster. Sometimes, predators struck directly. Stories whispered around fires told of hunters dragged into the snow, of children snatched from the edge of camp. Whether these were memory or myth, we cannot know. But forensic evidence supports the fear. Human skeletons with puncture marks from massive fangs, claw gashes etched into ribs. These grisly remnants confirm that humans were not always the victors in these encounters. And yet, there was also respect. Predators were feared, but they were also admired. In myths, wolves were guides, lions were guardians, saber-tooths were spirits of strength. Their ferocity became lessons, their endurance a model. By watching them, hunters learned patience, learned cooperation, learned when to strike. In this way, predators became teachers as much as rivals. The plains were theaters of constant drama. Imagine a hunt interrupted. Hunters drive a bison into ambush, spears flying, when suddenly a pack of wolves bursts from the trees, snarling, lunging for the same kill. Or a group of people skinning a caribou, only to hear the guttural growl of a saber-tooth behind them. These moments blurred the line between hunting and being hunted, reminding the people that they were never alone in their pursuit. Even today, the fossil record preserves these encounters. Piles of bones in tar pits show animals and predators alike trapped together. Mammoths, bison, saber-tooths, dire wolves, all entangled in death. Some sites reveal layered evidence of human activity among predator remains, as if scavenging took place after a great kill. To study these sites is to glimpse snapshots of chaos frozen in time. For the people who lived it, however, there was no distance, no archaeology, only the raw immediacy of survival. They sharpened spears by firelight, their ears straining for distant howls. They huddled close in storms, children pressed between adults, knowing that wolves prowled just beyond sight. They prayed to spirits, sang to fire, carried each other's weight, because to falter was to feed the predators. The predators of the plains did not stop humanity's journey, but they shaped it, sharpened it, carved fear and respect into the hearts of those who walked the land bridge. In every cautious glance at the horizon, in every hurried meal before nightfall, in every ritual that gave meaning to danger, the presence of predators left its mark. And so, The people endured, not in defiance of the predators, but alongside them, as part of the same frozen theater of survival. Blood has always been the price of survival. On the icy plains of Beringia, that truth was written across snow in crimson stains, each hunt, each clash, each accident leaving behind its testimony. For the hunters of the North, blood on the ice was both a sign of triumph and of tragedy, proof that life was wrestled from a merciless land, and proof that death walked close at hand. The hunts were brutal affairs. To bring down a bison or mammoth required courage beyond measure. Hunters surged forward in unison, spears thrusting into muscle, stone blades cutting through thick hides. Animals bellowed, thrashing with horns, trampling the ground into chaos. Snow churned into red slush under hooves and boots. A single misstep could mean a shattered rib, a broken leg, a horn's lethal puncture. Blood sprayed, steaming in the cold air, as man and beast fought in a contest older than memory. When the animal finally fell, silence descended like a shroud. Hunters knelt beside the carcass, their own hands bleeding from gashes, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Victory was never clean. It carried the scent of iron and the weight of wounds. In the stillness, they gave thanks, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, to the spirit of the beast, acknowledging that life had been taken so that life could continue. But not all blood spilled belonged to prey. Sometimes the hunters themselves fell, cut down by their quarry. A mammoth's tusk could impale. A bison's charge could crush bones beyond healing. A saber-tooth's claws could leave gaping wounds. Archaeological finds bear witness. Human skeletons with healed fractures in ribs and arms. Evidence of hunters who survived their injuries but carried scars for life. Others reveal more final fates. Puncture marks in bones. Skulls caved in by blunt trauma. Wounds consistent with accidents in the hunt. Forensic anthropology reads these remains like grim diaries, each fracture a line of testimony in the saga of survival. The people learned to read wounds too. Around fires, elders showed children scars, teaching them caution. This, they might say, pointing to a twisted arm, was from a bison's horn. Do not approach from the side. In this way, blood was also knowledge, carried in flesh and memory, passed to the next generation as warning. Sometimes, hunters bore their wounds with pride. A scar across the face became a mark of courage. A limp earned in the chase was proof of endurance. They were reminders that bloodshed did not always mean death, that survival itself could be victory. Yet, death was never far. When a hunter fell in the snow, bleeding out beneath gray skies, the survivors faced grim choices. To carry the body home might mean losing the kill, and thus risking the lives of the whole group. To abandon the body was unthinkable, yet sometimes unavoidable. In such moments, blood on the ice became not only a mark of life lost, but also a mark of sacrifice, the silent toll of existence in the frozen north. Archaeological evidence hints at these dilemmas. At certain sites, butchered animal bones lie scattered beside human remains, suggesting hunters died where they struck their prey. Some skeletons bear both cut marks from predators and signs of human handling, as if survivors retrieved what they could before wolves arrived. These overlapping traces blur the line between triumph and disaster, showing us that each hunt carried the possibility of both feast and mourning. Blood also spilled within the camp, though more rarely. Disputes could erupt over food, over territory, over leadership. The stress of hunger sharpened tempers, and sometimes violence followed. Forensic analysis of ancient skulls has revealed blunt force trauma not easily explained by hunting accidents. Such wounds suggest conflict, perhaps even murder, etched into bone for eternity. These findings remind us that the shadows of human rivalry also haunted the ice. Still, most bloodshed came not from rage, but from necessity. The butchering of prey was itself a bloody ritual, one that demanded precision and endurance. Knives carved thick slabs of meat, marrow cracked from bones, hides stripped and stretched, blood pooled and froze, staining the snow long after the hunters had moved on. To predators, these sights were invitations. Wolves and lions prowled the edges, drawn by the scent. For the people, it was a race. Harvest as much as possible before danger arrived. The children saw all of this. They watched blood steam in the cold, watched their parents' hands red to the wrist, watched wounds stitched with sinew and sealed with fat. For them, blood was not shocking. It was part of the rhythm of life. They grew up knowing that survival was written in red. At times, storms turned bloody work into peril. Imagine hunters laboring over a mammoth kill as the wind rises, snow driving into their faces, visibility shrinking. Wolves appear in the storm, their forms flickering in the whiteout. The hunters slash and shout, brandishing torches, but the wolves circle closer. Blood drips into snow, mixing with ash from burning branches, a grim portrait of survival painted in stormlight. Even today, the earth preserves echoes of these scenes. In frozen deposits, mammoth bones still carry embedded spear points, a moment of impact locked in time. Some show cut marks overlapping predator tooth marks, evidence of desperate competition. Human bones, too, sometimes bear the scars of healing or the silence of final wounds. Archaeologists and forensic scientists read these traces, reconstructing dramas long vanished, reminding us that blood on the ice was more than metaphor. It was daily reality. To the people themselves, blood carried meaning beyond survival. In myths, blood was sacred, the life force that bound human and animal together. Some rituals smeared blood on tools, on fire pits, on the faces of hunters, marking them as bound to the prey they pursued. The spilling of blood was never taken lightly. It was recognized as an exchange, a debt owed to the land and to the spirits. This worldview gave strength in hardship. When a hunter died, his blood on the snow was not meaningless. It was sacrifice, remembered in song. When prey fell, its blood was honored, ensuring balance was maintained. In this way, the people found order in the chaos, dignity in the violence that survival demanded. Yet the red trail grew longer with every season. Each generation carried scars. Each migration added losses. Still, the people pressed onward. Their resilience was not born of ignorance of death, but of acceptance of it. They had learned that life and blood were inseparable on the ice. That survival meant enduring the cost. Blood on the ice was not only an ending, it was also a beginning. It nourished the soil, fed the predators, preserved stories in scars, and left traces in bones that we uncover today. It was the mark of humanity's persistence, proof that even in the harshest world, people endured, fought, and carried their fire forward. The plains ran red more times than we can count. But from those stains grew the story of survival, of migration, of destiny. For every life lost, others continued. For every wound suffered, others healed. Blood on the ice was both shadow and promise, pain and resilience. And as the hunters moved deeper into Beringia, leaving crimson trails behind them. The land remembered. Their struggles were etched into permafrost, into fossil, into memory. And we, thousands of years later, still read the story written there, a story of survival written in red upon white. In the frozen world of Beringia, survival was not only measured in hunts and hardships, it was also measured in memory, in story, in the laughter of children who carried the breath of the future. Around each fire, among the clusters of hides and bones, young voices mingled with the howl of wind. They were the children of the wind, raised in motion, shaped by migration, taught by the endless horizon itself. Their lives began with fragility. Infants were swaddled in furs, carried against their mothers' backs, protected from the bite of the cold. At night, they were tucked between parents, warmed by the press of bodies and the glow of fire. Every birth was a victory, a spark against the darkness, for the people knew too well how uncertain life could be. When a child survived their first winter, it was celebrated quietly, an affirmation that hope still walked among them. Children learned quickly that they were part of the struggle. As soon as their hands could grasp, they were given small tasks: gathering sticks, carrying water, scraping hides. Their toys were not idle things, but practice for life. Archaeological finds confirm this. Tiny ivory carvings shaped like animals, miniature spears knapped from stone, beads sewn into garments. These artifacts suggest that children were trained early, their play woven seamlessly into the skills they would need. A doll carved from bone was not only comfort, it was a lesson in clothing, in shaping, in identity. At night, stories filled their ears. Elders told of spirits who danced in the auroras, of animals who gave themselves willingly so that people might live. Children lay awake beneath hides, watching the flicker of fire on mammoth bone walls, absorbing myth as truth. In this way, memory became inheritance. The children became vessels of knowledge, carriers of maps, of taboos, of traditions that would guide them long after their elders were gone. They were restless, as all children are. When the wind surged across the plains, they raced it, laughing, their footprints scattering like sparks on snow. They learned to mimic the calls of birds, to chase hares in play, to pelt each other with handfuls of frost. Yet even in play, lessons were folded in. To move quickly, to keep balance on ice, to listen for the silence that warned of predators. These games were rehearsals for survival. There were dangers, always. A child wandering too close to thin ice, a sudden sickness, a predator lurking at the edge of camp. Parents watched anxiously, knowing how easily life could be stolen. Forensic evidence found in some burials tells us that children were not spared from hardship. Tiny skeletons with signs of malnutrition, stress etched into growing bones, teeth marked by periods of famine. Yet alongside these tragedies, archaeologists also find care. Graves with beads, ochre, and ornaments, proof that even the youngest were honored in death. But many lived, grew, and thrived. They learned to speak in songs, carried by the wind, their voices echoing across the plains. They absorbed the rhythm of migration, the folding of tents, the packing of sleds, the long marches where they walked at their parents' sides. In time, their small steps became steady. Their games gave way to real work. Boys joined hunts, carrying practice spears until they were ready to wield true ones. Girls mastered the arts of sewing, fire tending, and hide preparation. Though these roles often overlapped, Necessity blurred boundaries, and all hands turned to whatever task survival demanded. The children also carried dreams. They stared into the night sky and asked questions their elders could not fully answer. Why did the lights dance above? Why did the earth rumble and smoke in distant mountains? Why did the animals return each year, like spirits on a cycle? In those questions was curiosity, the seed of exploration, the quiet force that one day would carry their descendants across rivers, mountains, and an entire continent. We see hints of their imagination even today. Small carvings of animals, found in ancient campsites, bear the marks of both artistry and play. A piece of ivory shaped into a bird, its wings etched with care, may have been a toy or a charm. Footprints preserved in ancient mud reveal the patterns of children at play, darting and circling, mingling with those of giant sloths and mammoths. These discoveries remind us that children were not passive observers of prehistory. They were active voices, filling the silence with laughter and curiosity. For parents, children were more than joy. They were purpose. To endure hunger, to face predators, to walk endless miles through storms. These struggles gained meaning when small hands reached for theirs. Around the fire, a mother stitched beads into a daughter's garment, not only for decoration, but as a gift of identity. A father placed a child's hand upon a spear shaft, guiding it, teaching strength. These gestures were threads in a tapestry stretching beyond their own lives. The children of the wind also bore memory. When elders passed, it was the young who carried their stories forward. When camps moved, it was the children who remembered which river bend held fish, which valley sheltered herds, which ridge was haunted by predators. In this way, knowledge was not stored in books or carvings, but in living minds, flexible, mobile, eternal. Blood still marked their world, but children softened its edges. Their laughter echoed even after hunts turned bloody. Their songs rose even when storms battered camps. In the darkest times, when hunger gnawed and death loomed, the sight of a child's face, bright with survival, gave adults reason to push forward. For all the cruelty of the ice, the children carried its opposite: innocence, renewal, the promise of continuity. The wind itself seemed to carry them. Their cries mingled with its howl. Their games mirrored its restless motion. They were born in motion, raised in migration, destined to carry humanity farther than any elder could imagine. If the hunters and mothers were the strength of survival, then the children were its future. Fragile yet unyielding, soft yet unstoppable. Today, their traces remain scattered in soil and stone. Tiny tools, ornaments, footprints, bones laid carefully in graves. They are quiet testimonies that even in the harshest world, life was not only endured, but cherished. The children of the wind remind us that survival was not a grim march alone. It was also filled with laughter, with love, with hope whispered into the storm. And as the bands of families moved ever deeper into Beringia, it was the children who gave their footsteps meaning. They were the reason the people pressed onward, the reason fire was guarded through long nights, the reason blood was spilled and hardships borne. They were the continuity of life, the breath of the future, carried on the wind across the bridge of worlds. The land stretched before them in endless whiteness. No trees, no ridges, no clear horizon, only the great blank canvas of ice and snow, rolling in waves beneath the pale sky. For the first time, The hunters and their families felt not merely cold, but swallowed by it, as though they had stepped into a world stripped of shape and sound. This was the white expanse, the heart of Beringia in winter, where land and sky blurred together into silence. Each step sank into snow, crusted hard by wind. The people marched slowly, bodies bent against gusts that scoured their faces raw. Furs stiffened with frost, breath froze in beards and eyelashes, hands ached even within thick mittens of hide. The horizon seemed always near, yet never reached, a mirage that mocked their progress. Children stumbled, elders leaned heavily on poles, dogs whined in the biting air. The land gave no kindness, navigation was treacherous. With landmarks buried in snow, hunters turned to the stars when skies were clear, and to the wind when storms passed. They read subtle cues, invisible to modern eyes, the shape of drifts, the slope of hidden ridges, the faint line of frozen rivers. These skills, passed down through generations, guided them through the white desert where missteps meant death. Still, storms could erase even these signs. Blizzards swept across the plain, blotting out the world in curtains of snow. Entire groups huddled together, clutching children, shielding fire from the wind with hides and bone frames. Sometimes, despite their efforts, flames died, and the night grew long with hunger and silence. Archaeological evidence suggests that some camps perished in such storms. Stone tools scattered and abandoned, fire pits frozen mid-use, bones of both animals and humans left behind, a sudden end written in the snow. Yet, even here, life persisted. Hunters followed the faint tracks of caribou, shadows of mammoth herds trudging far ahead. They knew that to stop was to die. So they pressed on, moving camp after camp across the frozen horizon. Sleds groaned under loads of hides, meat, and tools, dragged by both human hands and dogs. Infants were carried against mothers' backs, wrapped tight, their small breaths puffing like sparks into the frigid air. The silence of the white expanse was broken only by the cries of predators. Wolves appeared as gray smudges in the distance, pacing along ridges of snow. Sometimes they came close, bold enough to test the edges of camp. At night, their howls rolled like thunder, surrounding the people in a ring of sound. The hunters sharpened their spears, laid stones ready for throwing, their eyes glinting in firelight. But the wolves often lingered beyond reach, waiting for weakness, waiting for blood on the snow. The frozen rivers were perhaps the greatest danger. Beneath their crust of ice, water still roared unseen. A single crack could swallow a man, a child, even an entire sled. Forensic evidence in some human remains reveals drowned lungs and shattered bones, hinting at tragedies beneath the ice. Animals, too, perished this way. Archaeologists have unearthed mammoth skeletons preserved in riverbeds, legs twisted where they fell through, frozen in place for eternity. Each such discovery reminds us of the peril faced with every crossing. Fire remained the people's anchor. In the white expanse, firelight was more than warmth. It was proof that life still resisted the cold void. Hunters gathered wood from sparse shrubs or carried bundles of bone to burn. The smell of fat sizzling in flame mingled with smoke, lifting spirits even as the land howled outside. Around these fragile circles of light, songs were sung to give courage. Children rocked to sleep by rhythm and voice, yet hunger pressed harder with each day. Herds moved slowly through the white, their trails faint, their bodies thin from scarcity. A failed hunt meant stomachs growling, eyes sunken, energy drained. Hunters grew gaunt, yet still rose each morning, spears in hand, scanning the endless plain for movement. Archaeological studies of bone collagen from this era reveal signs of nutritional stress, evidence that many lived on the brink of starvation. Each successful hunt a razor's edge away from collapse, and still they endured. They stitched hides tighter against the cold-fashioned snow shelters when storms raged, melted ice for water, shared every scrap of food. Children gnawed marrow from bones. Women boiled hides to create thin broth. Elders chewed frozen meat with toothless gums. No part of the kill was wasted. In their determination, they turned scarcity into survival. Each day, a small defiance against the void. There was also wonder, even here. At night, when the skies cleared, the auroras rippled with uncommon brilliance. Curtains of green, purple, and red shimmered above, reflecting off the snow in eerie glow. The people watched in awe, whispering to each other that these were spirits guiding their path, ancestors lighting the way. In the white expanse, where death always hovered, such visions gave hope, lifting weary feet another step forward. The children of this journey grew into resilience. Their first memories were not of valleys or forests, but of blank horizons and endless snow. They learned early to walk long distances, to brace against wind, to endure silence. Their games were imitations of hunters, throwing sticks into snow, chasing shadows, mimicking the calls of animals. In time, these children would become the first generation fully raised in motion across the bridge of worlds. Modern science gives us haunting glimpses of their lives. In layers of frozen mud, footprints remain, lines of adults, children, and animals press side by side. Some prints show dragging, as though someone stumbled or carried a heavy load. Others show small children walking within the steps of parents, protected from wind. These silent imprints, preserved for tens of thousands of years, bring us close to those who once trudged across the white expanse. They remind us that these journeys were real, lived step by fragile, determined bodies. Blood, too, marked this place. Hunters who fell to exhaustion, prey struck down on the ice, predators slain in defense, all left stains that froze into the land. Forensic analysis of preserved remains tells us of cracked ribs, torn tendons, spear points lodged deep. These were not the signs of mythical heroes, but of ordinary people pushing their bodies to the limit, surviving because they must. The white expanse was unforgiving, but it was not endless. On its far side, lands opened again, dotted with shrubs, rivers, and signs of greater life. But reaching them demanded everything. Only those willing to march into silence, to trust fire and memory, to carry children through storms, could pass. Those who faltered were left behind, their bones merging with snow, their stories carried only by survivors' lips. For the hunters of Beringia, stepping into the white expanse was stepping into the unknown. They could not see the future awaiting them. New lands, new animals, new dangers. But they felt its pull. Each footprint pressed into the snow was a statement. We are still here. We will endure. We will cross. And so, the whites swallowed their shapes, leaving only the glow of fire behind them. The echo of songs carried on the wind. Their march into emptiness was not in vain, for it led them ever closer to the continent that waited in silence, vast and untouched, a world yet to be claimed by human feet. Survival in the Ice Age North was not only a matter of courage, but of craft. Each band of hunters carried with them a treasury of skills, honed over generations, whispered from parent to child, tested against the storms. These were the echoes of survival, tools, habits, and traditions that allowed fragile humans to endure in a world that seemed bent on erasing them. The first echo was fire. To coax flame from stone and tinder was to summon life itself. Hunters struck flint against pyrite, catching sparks in nests of dried grass or fungus. The flame flickered, grew, and was fed carefully with twigs, then branches, until it roared against the cold. Fire was warmth, light, and defense. It hardened spear points, cooked meat, dried hides, and drove away predators lurking in the dark. Without fire, survival was measured in hours. With it, the people could endure weeks of endless night. The second echo was shelter. On the open plains, where winds cut like knives, they built homes from what the land offered. Circles of mammoth bones formed the frames of huts, covered with hides stitched together into waterproof skins. Snow itself was carved into blocks for walls, trapping warmth within. Inside these shelters, families huddled together, their breath mingling in the small space, their fire pits dug into the ground. Archaeological sites in Siberia and Ukraine still preserve such dwellings, rings of mammoth bones marking where homes once stood, the ash of long dead fires blackening the soil. These silent ruins remind us that survival was not improvised, but engineered with care. The third echo was clothing. Against the relentless cold, the people stitched garments layer upon layer, reindeer hide for softness, mammoth hide for durability, fur turned inward for warmth. Needles carved from bone pierced hides with sinew thread, pulling garments tight. Parkas, leggings, mittens, boots, all fashioned with skill that modern winter gear still mimics. Some archaeological finds even reveal decorative touches: beads sewn into seams, fringes cut into edges, signs that survival did not mean surrendering beauty. The people clothed themselves not only to endure, but to express identity in the face of hardship. Food was the heartbeat of survival. Meat was hunted, but survival meant more than feasting on the fresh kill. Fat was rendered into oil for lamps. Meat was sliced thin and dried in the wind, stored for leaner days. Bones were cracked for marrow, hides boiled into broth, sinew dried for thread. Nothing was wasted, for to waste was to invite hunger's return. Forensic studies of human remains from this era show wear on teeth from chewing hides and sinew, proof that every resource was used, every scrap valued. These marks in bone are echoes of lives lived on the edge. But survival was not only physical, it was communal. Families shared what they had. When one hunt failed, another camp might give meat. When an elder's hands grew too weak to sew, a younger hand stitched in their place. Archaeological evidence hints at care for the sick and wounded. Skeletons with healed fractures, injuries that would have crippled hunters if not for the help of their group. Such findings tell us that these people endured not as solitary individuals, but as communities bound by loyalty and compassion. Memory was survival too. Elders taught which plants could be eaten, which rivers froze last, which valleys sheltered herds. This knowledge was not written, but spoken, sung, and repeated until it became part of the children's minds. Songs recounted journeys, stories warned of dangers. Myths explained the mysteries of fire, wind, and sky. In this way, survival was also cultural. Each fire crackle, each tale told in the dark, was an echo of survival carried forward to the next generation. There were also small inventions that seem simple to us, but were revolutionary. Nets woven from sinew allowed fishing through cracks in the ice. Hooks carved from bone drew trout and salmon from freezing rivers. Snowshoes, frames of wood and hide, spread weight across the surface, preventing hunters from sinking. Sleds dragged loads farther than hands alone could carry. Each tool extended the body's reach, transforming fragile humans into resilient survivors. Still, danger pressed always. Storms struck without warning. Food vanished. Predators prowled. In such times, the echoes of survival were tested. Camps collapsed. Fires died. Clothing tore. Yet people rebuilt, rekindled, resued. Their skills became habits. Their habits became instinct, until survival was woven into every gesture. For the children, these lessons began early. Small hands learned to strike sparks, to scrape hides, to tie knots. Archaeologists have found miniature tools among Ice Age sites, tiny knives, beads, and ornaments, proof that even play was preparation. These artifacts remind us that survival was taught not in sudden crises, but in daily repetition, echo after echo, until the skills became as natural as breath. Death was not absent from this pattern. Some failed, some perished, but even in death, survival echoed. Burials with tools, ornaments, and ochre tell us that the dead were remembered, their knowledge not lost, but honored. Bones bearing signs of careful placement show that grief was part of survival too. The recognition that life's continuity required memory of those who had gone before. Today, we still hear those echoes, in the soot of hearths buried deep in soil, in the polish of bone needles worn smooth by years of use, in the cut marks on animal bones, sharp and deliberate, showing where blades once worked. Each fragment is a whisper from the past. We endured. We survived. For the hunters of Beringia, survival was not luck, nor chance. It was the sum of thousands of small decisions, careful skills, shared burdens. It was fire coaxed from stone, hide stitched by hand, stories sung into the night. It was compassion for the weak, patience in hunger, courage in the face of storms. These were the echoes that carried them across the white expanse, that would carry them farther still into lands no human had ever seen. And in those echoes lies the heart of humanity itself, the quiet defiance of fragility, the insistence on endurance, the promise that no matter how cold the world becomes, the spark of life can survive. At last, the white gave way. After weeks, perhaps months, of trudging across the endless expanse of Beringia, the land began to change. The horizon no longer shimmered with nothingness. It broke into hills and valleys, into shapes that whispered of difference. Here, the snow thinned in places, and shrubs clustered in defiance of the wind. The people stopped, staring at a world that seemed both familiar and utterly strange. The first horizon was more than a line of earth against sky. It was the threshold into a new continent, though they could not yet know it. For the hunters and their families, it was simply a place where the land changed, where opportunities might lie. But in truth, it was the moment when humanity stepped into the Americas, leaving the long familiarity of Siberia and Beringia behind. They advanced cautiously. Hunters spread ahead, scanning for signs of danger. Spears were ready, eyes sharp. Children clutched mothers' hides, wide-eyed at the shrubs swaying in the breeze, the trickle of streams free from ice. Even the air smelled different, less of endless snow, more of soil, of growth waiting to happen. Soon, they saw animals unlike those they had known. Still, there were mammoths and bison, but smaller creatures scurried in the undergrowth. Hares with mottled fur, birds that darted in quick bursts, foxes with fiery coats that startled the children with their brightness. Tracks pressed into mud showed claws and hooves not immediately recognized. Each new sign was a mystery, each cry in the distance an unanswered question. For the hunters, this was both wonder and danger. Unknown animals meant unknown behaviors. Could they be hunted? Were they dangerous? Which were edible? Which poisonous? The people learned quickly, testing with caution, guided by instinct and story. In this way, the first horizon became not only a frontier of land, but a frontier of knowledge. Archaeological evidence tells us that these early arrivals adapted swiftly. Stone tools found in Alaska and Yukon, shaped differently from those in Siberia, suggest experimentation. New forms of blades better suited to new prey, new environments. Hearths reveal charred bones of animals distinct from the Old World, proof that the people tested, tasted, and incorporated the unfamiliar into survival. In some sites, bird bones bear cut marks from stone knives, showing that even the smallest creatures became part of the diet. The land itself seemed to welcome and test them in equal measure. Valleys offered shelter, rivers offered fish, hills provided vantage. Yet storms still swept across, and predators lurked unseen. Dire wolves prowled here as well, their howls echoing across the night. Perhaps new predators waited too, creatures the people had never faced. Each day became a lesson, each night a test of vigilance. Still, there was awe. Children marveled at streams that ran free of ice, their surfaces sparkling with reflected auroras. Women plucked berries in summer thickets, tasting sweetness unknown in the tundra. Hunters watched flocks of birds rise in clouds, filling the sky with sound and motion. These were small wonders, but in a life shaped by scarcity, they were treasures. It is likely that myths began to shift here. Elders who once told stories of spirits tied to the frozen plains now spoke of new spirits, ones hidden in forests and streams. The first horizon was not only a physical boundary, but a spiritual one, a place where memory and imagination had to stretch to fit the strangeness of new land. In their songs and stories, the people wove these discoveries into meaning, explaining the unfamiliar through the voices of gods and ancestors. Evidence of these transitions lingers. In some archaeological sites, symbolic carvings emerge, lines etched into bone, abstract shapes that may represent more than mere decoration. Could they be the beginnings of new myths, scratched into matter as the people struggled to make sense of change? We cannot know for certain, but the suggestion is there, that the first horizon reshaped not only bodies, but minds. The hunters tested their skills against new prey. Elk and moose, taller than any deer they had known, became targets of spears. Their bones, found with cut marks, tell us the people succeeded. Fish hooks carved from bone show that rivers teeming with salmon were quickly mastered. The people proved once again what had carried them this far: adaptation, swift and relentless. But danger still shadowed them. Some skeletons reveal parasites in their bones, illnesses likely contracted from new foods or water. Others bear wounds consistent with predator attack, perhaps lions or bears striking in forests where hunters were less accustomed. The forensic record shows that survival here was as costly as ever, each new lesson paid for in blood. And yet the first horizon marked a turning point. For the first time, the people were no longer simply surviving in a familiar pattern. They were entering a land that demanded invention, demanded new myths, new tools, new courage. In crossing into it, they began the slow spread that would carry their descendants to every corner of the Americas. The moment itself, when they first stood upon a ridge and looked out across a land no human had ever touched, must have been breathtaking. Snow gleamed on distant peaks. Rivers sparkled like silver threads. Forests whispered with life. The air carried the cries of birds they had never heard before. To stand there was to stand at the edge of the known world, to face not emptiness, but abundance. Children ran ahead, chasing foxes through the brush. Hunters knelt by new plants, tasting leaves, spitting some out, keeping others. Women gathered stones, testing which flaked best into blades. Every sense was alive, every step a question, and with each answer, survival became more certain. The first horizon did not end hunger, did not banish predators, did not silence storms, but it gave the people hope. It showed them that beyond the white emptiness lay land that could sustain, land that could be learned, land that might one day be called home. Archaeologists who study these sites today find not grand monuments, but simple remains. Flakes of stone, bones cracked for marrow, charcoal and soil. Yet in these humble traces lies the echo of that first encounter with a new world. They remind us that history's greatest journeys begin not with conquest, but with small steps, cautious trials, and the courage to keep moving forward. The first horizon was the threshold of destiny. Humanity had crossed it, and nothing would ever be the same. The first horizon had opened onto a land rich with life. But among the shrubs and rivers and new forests, the greatest surprises were the giants. The people who crossed into the Americas stepped into a bestiary that seemed carved from myth, creatures whose size and strangeness dwarfed anything they had ever known. To encounter them was to stand in awe, to feel both hunger and fear, to realize that the new land was not empty. It was alive with titans. The mastodon was among the first. Like the mammoths of the old world, mastodons were immense, their shoulders towering above men, their tusks curving in broad arcs. But they were different too. Their bodies stockier, their teeth built not for grazing grass, but for chewing leaves and twigs. These forest dwellers crashed through thickets, tearing branches with trunks and tusks, shaking the ground with every step. To the hunters, they were both familiar and strange, like mammoths, yet not mammoths, echoing the known world, but in new form. The people followed cautiously, testing their courage against these giants. A fallen mastodon meant food beyond measure, tons of meat, hides enough to clothe a camp, tusks to carve into tools. But to bring one down was no small feat. Spears had to find the soft parts, behind the ribs, under the jaw, while avoiding the sweep of tusks that could crush a man in an instant. Forensic evidence on mastodon bones tells this story. Stone spear points embedded deep, cut marks etched across ribs, proof that humans indeed hunted these giants. Some skeletons even show multiple wounds from coordinated attacks, suggesting groups of hunters working together in desperate precision. But mastodons were not the only giants here. In the forests and plains lumbered the ground sloth, creatures larger than any bear, with claws like sickles and hides armored with bone nodules beneath their fur. They moved slowly when feeding, tearing branches with massive arms, but when threatened, they reared on hind legs, towering twice the height of a man, swinging claws that could disembowel in an instant. To face such a creature was to face the embodiment of raw strength. Archaeologists have found signs of these encounters too. Ground sloth bones marked with cut scars sites where their remains mingle with stone tools, suggesting that humans dared to hunt, or at least scavenge, them. In some cases, dung deposits preserved in caves show that people used sloth dung as fuel, a small but vital resource in a cold world. Even in death, the giants provided. And then there were the glyptodons, armored behemoths shaped like living fortresses. Imagine an armadillo, but the size of a car. Its back a dome of bone plates, its tail a heavy club studded with spikes. To the hunters, it must have seemed both beast and boulder, an almost invulnerable creature. Striking at one was folly. Instead, they likely waited for accidents, for the beast to stumble into rivers or mud. When they succeeded, the reward was immense: meat thick and rich, and a shell that could be used as shelter, a ready-made roof against the storm. Archaeological finds hint at such uses: shell fragments bearing marks of human modification, transformed from armor into architecture. These encounters were not only with beasts of flesh, but with myth. Around fires, stories grew. Children listened with wide eyes as elders spoke of animals taller than trees, of sloths whose claws could tear the sky, of armored beasts that carried mountains on their backs. These tales were not exaggerations. They were reflections of truth, shaped into story so that memory might endure. In time, such stories would echo in the oral traditions of native peoples across the continent, echoes of giants long gone but never forgotten. Predators, too, grew larger here. The short-faced bear, towering over men, even on all fours, roamed the plains with speed surprising for its bulk. Its skull, found in fossil beds, reveals jaws built for crushing, a body built for pursuit. For a human to face one was to face death itself. Hunters learned to give them wide berth, to yield kills rather than fight, to mark the bear as both danger and spirit. For the people stepping into this land, each giant was both a trial and a gift. To kill one was to ensure survival for weeks, perhaps months. But the risk was great, and the losses real. Human skeletons unearthed in North and South America bear fractures consistent with crushing blows. Ribs snapped inward, skulls broken as if by massive force. These forensic traces tell us what stories cannot: that some who faced the giants did not survive, and yet humanity adapted. New hunting strategies emerged. Spears grew sturdier, stone points broader. Groups learned to drive mastodons into bogs, to harry sloths until exhaustion slowed them, to exploit the vulnerabilities of even the most formidable prey. Each success was etched into memory, passed to children, told in song. The giants were not invincible. They could be overcome, not easily, not without cost, but through cooperation, patience, and courage. The awe they inspired went beyond necessity. To stand before a mastodon was to stand before something larger than imagination. To hear the roar of a sloth rearing in fury was to feel the tremor of the earth itself. The people lived in constant dialogue with giants, sometimes as hunters, sometimes as scavengers, sometimes as the hunted themselves. This relationship shaped not only survival, but identity. Archaeological sites across the Americas preserve these encounters in fragmentary echoes. At some, clusters of stone spear points lie among mastodon bones, frozen in time like the remnants of a desperate battle. At others, cut marks on massive bones reveal the precision of butchery, proof that hunters knew where to strike. In caves, sloth dung remains layered with human hearth ash, evidence that even the waste of giants became part of human survival. Each fragment is an echo, each echo a glimpse into the drama of these meetings. The children of the first horizon must have been awed. Their small hands traced the prints of giants pressed deep into mud, footprints the size of their entire bodies. They must have asked questions their parents could not fully answer. Where did these beasts come from? Why had they not walked the old lands? Were they spirits, or animals, or both? In their curiosity lay the beginnings of myth, the weaving of giants into the spiritual fabric of their world. And in time, as generations passed, these encounters shaped not only myth, but destiny. For while giants seemed eternal, they were not. The fossil record tells us that within a few thousand years of human arrival, many of these titans were gone, hunted, stressed by climate change, their populations dwindling. The people who once gazed in awe at mastodons and sloths became witnesses to their disappearance. The giants became ghosts, their echoes lingering in story and soil. But in this moment, in the days of first encounter, they were real. The hunters stood before them, spears in trembling hands, hearts pounding, eyes wide with both terror and hunger. Blood spilled, roars echoed, lives were risked. And from these struggles, humanity carved its place in the new world. The encounters with giants were not simply episodes of survival. They were defining chapters of humanity's relationship with nature, chapters that still echo in the bones we unearth, the myths we inherit, the awe we feel at the thought of walking beside creatures larger than imagination. For the people of the first horizon, the giants were both barrier and bridge. To face them was to face fear. To conquer them was to conquer the new land. And so, step by step, kill by kill, story by story, they wrote themselves into the vast drama of the Americas, forever marked by the shadows of giants. Snow was both shroud and witness. It covered the land in silence, hiding tracks, muffling sound, swallowing breath. And when lives ended, as they so often did in this frozen world, the snow became the first blanket over the fallen. Bones in the snow were the most enduring memory of the Ice Age, scattered across the land like fragments of unfinished stories. Death was no stranger to these people. Hunters fell beneath the weight of tusks and hooves. Children succumbed to sickness in winter nights when fire grew weak. Elders, worn thin by years of hunger and strain, closed their eyes beside the fire and did not open them again. For each loss, grief was heavy, but life demanded motion. The herds moved, storms came, and the living had to follow. Bones left behind were at once heartbreak and inevitability. When the ground allowed, burials carried meaning. In shallow pits, hacked from frozen soil, bodies were laid to rest, wrapped in hides, sprinkled with ochre, adorned with beads or tools. Archaeologists uncover such graves today, the ochre still staining soil red, ivory beads scattered around fragile bones, stone blades resting at a warrior's side. These burials reveal not only death, but reverence, the recognition that life was sacred, even in its ending. Some burials were elaborate, suggesting ritual. At one site in Siberia, the body of a child was found surrounded by ivory ornaments, hundreds of painstakingly carved beads sewn into garments. Another grave revealed twin infants buried together, their small skeletons embraced in death, as though the community sought to keep them close in eternity. These discoveries remind us that even amid hardship, love endured, and grief was expressed in ways that reached beyond survival. Yet not all could be buried. Often the snow itself became the grave. Hunters lost in storms vanished beneath drifts, their bodies never recovered. Animals dragged others away, leaving only scattered bones when spring thaw revealed the ground. In some rare cases, permafrost preserved them in eerie detail: flesh, hair, even the contents of stomachs sealed in ice. Forensic analysis of such finds reveals final moments: the broken ribs of a fall, the ash of smoke inhaled during a fire, the half-digested plants of a last meal. These preserved bodies speak across millennia, voices frozen in silence. The people feared such fates, but they also understood them. To leave bones in the snow was not abandonment, it was surrender to the land. The spirits, they believed, would receive the dead whether buried or left in ice. Around campfires, stories gave meaning to this truth. The auroras above were the souls of the lost, dancing across the sky. The wind carried whispers of ancestors who guided the living onward. Sometimes, the bones themselves became part of memory. Skulls were kept, painted with ochre, placed in sacred places. Tusks, or teeth of animals, and occasionally of humans, were fashioned into ornaments, tokens of continuity between living and dead. Archaeologists have found pendants made from human teeth, drilled carefully for stringing. Whether worn as mourning or protection, they testify to the ways memory clung to matter, ensuring that those who died were carried still. The snow preserved not only the bodies of humans, but of animals too. Mammoths felled in hunts lay half-buried, their tusks jutting like frozen monuments. Wolves that starved in storms left skeletons curled in drifts. When the thaw came, bones emerged in pale scatterings, mingling human and beast together in a single tableau of survival's cost. Even now, archaeologists uncover these mingled remains, sites where cut marks on animal bones lie beside human burials, proof that death was never isolated but part of the wider rhythm of life and loss. Forensic studies bring these shadows into focus. Skeletal analysis reveals not only cause of death, but cause of life. Enamel showing famine in childhood, bones bent from malnutrition, healed fractures speaking of survival after injury. Each skeleton is a biography without words, a record of hardship written in calcium and scar. These studies confirm what story already suggests: that survival here was balanced always against the weight of loss. The children saw it all. They watched as burials were made, as ochre-stained hands read, as songs of mourning rose into the cold air. They learned that death was part of the journey, that grief could be carried but not denied. In time, they too would take part, helping dig shallow graves, placing beads on the bodies of kin, whispering prayers into the wind. Through them, the rituals endured, echoing across generations. Some nights, when the auroras flickered, families spoke the names of the dead aloud, keeping memory alive. To forget was unthinkable. Memory itself was survival, and bones in the snow were reminders that each step forward was paid for by those who no longer walked. The landscape carried these reminders too. Valleys where storms had claimed lives were avoided. Rivers where hunters drowned were spoken of in hushed tones. Place itself became haunted, mapped not only by resources, but by tragedy. These oral geographies guided migration, blending memory and caution into the very routes the people took. Today, archaeologists stumble upon these echoes in unexpected places. A scatter of beads where once a garment lay, a child's tooth, worn but intact, nestled in soil, a femur fractured long ago, and healed, evidence of care given by kin. These details, humble yet profound, reveal the humanity of those who lived and died in a world of snow. They remind us that bones are not merely remnants, they are voices, carrying stories of endurance, loss, and love. The people themselves must have felt the same. Standing over a grave, watching snow fall over a loved one's body, they must have known that life pressed forward regardless. Hunger returned, predators prowled, herds moved. Grief was heavy, but fire had to be lit. Children had to be fed. Footsteps had to continue. To stop was to join the bones in the snow. And so they carried grief as they carried tools. Always present, always heavy, but never enough to halt the journey. In their songs, in their stories, in their rituals, they wove sorrow into strength. Each death was remembered not as an end, but as part of the path, a sacrifice that gave meaning to the survival of others. The snow held their bones, but the living carried their spirit. And together, both the dead and the living pressed forward across the land bridge, deeper into the continent that awaited them. Bones in the snow were not only reminders of mortality, they were also monuments to endurance, markers of the cost of life. They told the people that survival had meaning because it was not guaranteed. They told them that every fire lit, every child carried, every hunt won was precious beyond measure. Even now, when archaeologists kneel in frozen soil and brush away the snow to uncover ancient bones, the echoes return. They are echoes not of despair, but of continuity, the proof that humanity endures, even when the snow would bury all trace. And so, the journey continued. The bones remained behind, silent against the cold. But the living pressed onward, carrying memory, carrying fire, carrying the fragile thread of life into the vastness of the Americas. The land was vast, and the people were few. As families pressed deeper into the Americas, following herds and rivers, they faced choices that would shape their destiny. The continent stretched outward in every direction, rich and strange, filled with promise and danger alike. To survive here meant not only to endure, but to decide. And so, slowly, quietly, the first great divisions began. Some groups chose to stay near the familiar edges of Beringia. There, resources were known, hunting grounds already tested, shelters already built. They had learned the patterns of the land, the migrations of caribou, the cycles of rivers, the places where storms hit hardest. To them, pushing farther south seemed reckless. Better to hold to the known world, to endure instability, than to gamble on the unknown. Others, however, felt the pull of new horizons. The herds drifted farther south, rivers beckoned like roads, forests promised game and wood. Hunger pressed behind them, curiosity pulled ahead. Small bands split away, shouldering their packs, taking children by the hand, striking into valleys no one had yet mapped. Their fires disappeared into distance, leaving only ash and footprints as proof they had ever been part of the whole. This was not a dramatic sundering, but a slow drift. Families followed different herds, built camps in different valleys, lingered longer in different shelters. Over years, these choices stretched into permanence. Groups that once shared fires no longer saw each other. Paths diverged, and with them, the shape of humanity in the New World began to branch. Archaeological evidence preserves faint echoes of these divisions. In some regions, camps show continuity with Siberian traditions. The same types of stone blades, the same ornaments, the same burial practices. In others, differences emerge, new tool shapes, new hunting strategies, suggesting that groups adapted independently to local conditions. Even genetic studies of ancient remains confirm these splits, lineages branching early, separating into distinct populations that spread across the continent. Each discovery reminds us that splitting paths was not only a social event, but a biological one, the seed of future diversity. The emotional toll of such divisions must have been heavy. Around firelight, families once tied by kinship faced partings that might never be undone. A son choosing to follow a herd south, a daughter leaving with her partner's group, elders left behind to fade into the snow. Farewells were spoken in tears and silence, knowing that the distances of this new land made reunion almost impossible. For the children, such partings became their first taste of a larger world, learning that kinship could scatter like sparks on wind. The landscape itself encouraged divergence. Wide rivers cut barriers between groups. Mountain ridges forced detours. Storms isolated camps for weeks or months. In these separations, cultures began to drift. Songs changed slightly. Myths grew different. Toolmaking took on new shapes. Over generations, the echoes grew stronger, until what began as small differences became distinct traditions. To the people, such divergence was natural. They were hunters and wanderers. They had always moved with the herds. Yet within these movements lay the seeds of transformation. Some groups clung to the icy north, where mammoth and caribou still roamed. Others pressed southward into forests where mastodons and sloths reigned. Still others followed coasts, learning the wealth of the sea. Each path shaped them differently, each environment carving its mark into their way of life. Evidence of this spread is etched into bone. Forensic studies of early skeletons in the Americas revealed diets shifting with geography. Some lived heavily on land animals, others on fish and shellfish, others on mixed diets of plants and prey. The bones themselves tell the story of adaptation. Different stresses in joints, different wear on teeth, different signs of survival strategies. Each skeleton is a branch of the tree, a record of how humanity diversified in this vast new world. The splitting of paths was not merely about survival, it was also about imagination. To step away from the known was to embrace uncertainty, to create new stories, new spirits, new destinies. Around fires, elders may have spoken of kin who had gone south, weaving mystery around their fate. Did they prosper? Did they perish? Did they meet strange spirits in the forests? These questions must have lingered, carried on the wind as whispers of other lives being lived beyond sight. For those who stayed behind, the memory of the departed became part of ritual. Songs carried their names. Myths explained their absence. The auroras perhaps imagined as messengers carrying glimpses of their journey. For those who went forward, memory of home became a talisman, a carved bead, a remembered song, a tool shaped in the old style. In this way, the paths never fully severed. Threads of kinship stretched across distance, invisible yet enduring. Modern archaeologists, piecing together these fragments, see the pattern clearly. Camps separated by hundreds of miles show common ancestry and tools, yet local variations hint at innovation. Genetic studies trace lines splitting, branching, reconnecting, like rivers across a plain. The story of humanity in the Americas is not a single line, but a web of paths, each chosen by families facing hunger, storms, and hope. For the people themselves, the splitting of paths was not destiny, not science, Not history, it was survival. To follow the herds was to live. To stay behind was to endure. To wander elsewhere was to take risk, to gamble on possibility. None of them could see the vastness of what they had begun. But in those quiet partings, in those footsteps diverging across snow and soil, they had already ensured that humanity would not only survive, but thrive in countless forms across an entire hemisphere. The snow held the memory of their footprints for only days before wind erased them. But beneath that erasure lay permanence. For in truth, their paths never vanished. They split, they spread, they multiplied, until the whole of the Americas bore the mark of their decisions. The rivers were the arteries of the New World. They wound through valleys and plains, cutting paths across the land, carrying both danger and promise. For the people pressing deeper into the Americas, these rivers became guides, lifelines, and silent companions. To follow a river was to follow survival. Water meant more than thirst quenched. Rivers teemed with fish, their silver bodies flashing in the current. Salmon surged upstream in seasonal migrations, their numbers so vast that the water itself seemed to shimmer with life. Trout, sturgeon, and countless other species darted beneath the ice, waiting for clever hands to draw them out. To hunters long reliant on mammoth and bison, the rivers offered a new gift: steady, abundant food, if only they could master its capture. And master it they did. Hooks carved from bone, nets woven from sinew, spears tipped with barbs. These became tools of the river. Archaeologists find them still. Delicate fish hooks lying in ancient soil, net weights carved from stone, spear points stained with traces of fish bone. At campsites along ancient riverbanks, layers of charred fish bones remain, blackened by fire, telling us that the people feasted here, that the rivers gave generously when herds were scarce. But the rivers were not only tables of abundance, they were roads. To follow a river was to follow its course into the heart of the continent. Water carved pathways where forests might otherwise block passage, where mountains might force detours. Families set camps along bends, moved with the current, used rivers as threads to stitch their journeys together. The flow of water became the flow of humanity, carrying them ever deeper south. Still, the rivers carried peril. Ice crusted their surfaces in winter, fragile and deceptive. To step unwisely was to vanish beneath. Lungs filling with freezing water, body carried downstream. Forensic evidence from skeletal remains reveals such tragedies. Ribs fractured in the violence of water. Bones found in riverbeds alongside animal remains. These are reminders that the rivers gave life, but also claimed it. Floods, too, struck with sudden violence. Snowmelt swelled streams into torrents, bursting banks, sweeping camps away. Archaeological surveys of floodplains show layers of human activity buried beneath sudden silt, as though entire encampments were swallowed in a single season. To the people, such floods must have seemed like the wrath of spirits, water turning from friend to foe in a heartbeat. Predators haunted the riverbanks as well. Wolves came to drink. Lions waited for prey, crossing shallows. Bears fished in silence. Hunters had to guard their families carefully, weapons always close at hand. To linger too long at a river's edge was to risk ambush, yet to avoid it was impossible. Rivers were essential, and so the people learned to live with their dangers, weaving vigilance into daily habit. Children grew up with the rivers as teachers. They learned to read currents, to watch for bubbles that betrayed fish, to test ice before stepping. They played in shallows during summer thaws, their laughter echoing against banks. They carried small nets, imitated their parents with miniature spears. Archaeologists have found tiny fish hooks, likely for children's use, proof that learning began early, that survival was taught in play long before adulthood. At night, rivers gave sound to silence. Camps built along their banks heard the constant rush of water beneath the stars. To weary travelers, this noise was comfort, a rhythm steady and eternal. Myths grew around these sounds. Spirits of water singing in the dark, ancestors guiding the flow, voices of the land itself. Around fires, elders told children that rivers were living beings, that to take fish was to honor the spirit of the water with song and offering. And so, rituals grew. Before casting nets, hunters might speak to the river, asking its permission. Before eating fish, families might leave a portion to the current, returning life to the flow. These practices bound the people to the rivers in respect, shaping a relationship that was not mere exploitation, but communion. The rivers also carried memory. Campsites became familiar across seasons. A certain bend remembered as the place of abundance, another as the place where a hunter drowned, another as the place where a child was born. These stories attached to the landscape, mapping rivers not only as physical routes, but as spiritual ones. To walk a river was to walk through history, to feel the weight of past footsteps beneath present ones. Modern excavations confirm these continuities. Along ancient river terraces, archaeologists uncover repeated layers of occupation, fire pits built one atop another, stone tools scattered across centuries. Charcoal analysis shows seasonal use, fish roasted in summer, larger game in winter. These sites tell us that rivers were not passing places, but anchors, nodes where life returned again and again. Rivers also shaped the spread of humanity itself. Genetic studies of early remains suggest rapid dispersal along waterways. Family groups fanning out with the flow. Within a few generations, rivers had carried them far south, stitching together a network of migration paths that spanned thousands of miles. In this sense, rivers were not just guides. They were engines of expansion. The rivers of life were paradoxes, nourishing yet perilous, predictable yet violent, familiar yet mysterious. To the people, they were both gift and trial, shaping every choice, every movement. Without them, survival would have faltered. With them, humanity spread into the deepest heart of the Americas. For the families who walked their banks, rivers became part of identity. They were not merely features of land, but companions of story, memory, and spirit. To follow a river was to follow destiny itself, carried forward by water's ceaseless song. And so, step by step, camp by camp, the people of the ice pressed deeper into the new world. Not blindly, not recklessly, but along the paths carved by water, guided by the rivers of life. The people moved on, but they did not vanish without trace. Every camp they raised, every fire they lit, every animal they butchered left behind small fragments. Fragments that time buried, but never erased. Long after footsteps melted from snow, long after bodies returned to soil, the land itself remembered. These remnants became the silent witnesses, carrying the voices of lives otherwise lost to silence. The most enduring of these witnesses were the tools. Flakes of stone scattered where hunters sat to nap new blades. Spear points broken in hunts lay where they fell, their edges dulled from striking bone. Scrapers and awls, once pressed into hides by calloused hands, remained after their owners were gone. Archaeologists uncover them now, fragile yet sharp, each one a message across time. We were here, we endured, we shaped the world with our hands. Some tools reveal haste, a point chipped quickly, edges rough, abandoned in urgency. Others show mastery, finely worked blades, symmetrical and gleaming even after millennia in soil. Together, they tell us that survival was not only about skill, but about moments, the hurried preparations before a storm, the long, patient work in seasons of calm. The tools speak, silently, of daily life lived on the edge of necessity. Alongside the tools are the hearths, fire pits dug into soil, blackened with ash, ringed by stones still cracked from heat. These are the hearts of vanished camps, circles where families once huddled, where stories once rose with smoke. Charcoal analysis reveals what burned: willow, spruce, bones of animals when wood was scarce. In some hearths, archaeologists find layers of ash built over centuries, evidence of repeated use. These fires, long extinguished, remain as silent witnesses to nights filled with warmth, fear, laughter, and song. Bones, too, remember. Animal remains, scattered and cut, testify to hunts long past. A mastodon rib with parallel grooves from stone blades. A bison femur cracked for marrow. A salmon spine charred in fire. Each mark is deliberate, each cut a voice speaking of hunger, of triumph, of survival. Forensic studies confirm these stories, showing us the precision of butchery, the careful extraction of every resource. Nothing was wasted. Everything bore the touch of human need. Sometimes, human bones lie among them. Skeletons with wounds that tell of violence. Fractured skulls, punctured ribs, breaks healed or left unhealed. These bones speak softly but clearly of lives lived in hardship, of struggles both with nature and within communities. They remind us that survival carried costs measured not only in animal blood, but in human pain. There are ornaments too, fragile yet persistent. Beads carved from ivory, drilled carefully and polished smooth. Pendants made from teeth, still gleaming after millennia. These are whispers of beauty, of identity, of moments when survival alone was not enough. When people adorned themselves, expressed meaning, carried memory. Archaeologists finding such pieces often remark on their delicacy, proof that even in a world of ice and death, the urge to create endured. The land preserves footprints as well. In rare patches of ancient mud, hardened into stone, the impressions of bare feet remain. Adults, children, even dogs. Some prints show dragging, as if burdened by heavy loads. Others show play, children circling, running, skipping. These silent witnesses are among the most haunting, for they capture not tools or bones, but moments of living motion, frozen in time. To stand in such a place is to feel the nearness of those who once walked there, to sense the warmth of lives long vanished. The silent witnesses are not only objects, but patterns. The placement of camps along rivers, the spacing of hearths, the scatter of bones all tell us how the people lived. Archaeologists read these arrangements like texts. Here was the butchering area. Here the sleeping space. Here the pile of discarded bones. In these patterns, the rhythm of life emerges, a reconstruction of days and nights otherwise forgotten. Even the soil carries memory. Microscopic traces of pollen show which plants grew, which seasons the camps were used. Ash mixed into layers reveals times of fire, perhaps accidental, perhaps ritual. Chemical analysis of soil near burials shows ochre leaching into ground, proof of ceremonial care. Each detail is small, but together they weave the silent testimony of lives that echo still. For the people themselves, none of this was meant as legacy. They did not imagine archaeologists kneeling with brushes thousands of years later. They left their traces because they lived, because survival demanded work, because life leaves marks whether we intend it or not. Yet in this unintended record lies their greatest voice. They speak not in words, but in flint, ash, and bone. To stand in a site today where stone flakes scatter like stars across the soil is to feel their presence. The silence is heavy, yet full. One can almost hear the crack of flint, the murmur of voices, the hiss of fire. The silent witnesses do not speak loudly, but they speak truly. They remind us that these journeys were real, that these people were not abstractions, but flesh and breath, who laughed, wept, struggled, and endured. The forensic record adds a darker layer. Cut marks on human bones suggest cannibalism in times of famine, harsh measures taken when survival allowed no other choice. Burned fragments of bone hint at rituals or at desperate attempts to extract nourishment from the very bodies of kin. These grim traces are also witnesses, telling us that life on the edge sometimes crossed into places we would rather not imagine. Yet they, too, are part of the truth, part of the story the land remembers. The silent witnesses endure because the land is vast and the cold preserves. The snow that once covered bones became their protector, the ice sealing away traces that would otherwise have been lost. Even now, as climate change melts permafrost, new remains emerge. Carcasses of mammoths, tools of stone, fragments of bone still bearing the scars of human knives. Each discovery is another voice, another whisper from the deep past. For the people themselves, every fire lit, every tool chipped, every burial made was part of the rhythm of life. They did not know they were leaving history. They only knew they were living. Yet it is in these traces, silent, fragile, scattered, that we know them best. And so, the journey of humanity through the Ice Age is written not only in blood and survival, but in the witnesses they left behind. The stones, the bones, the ashes, the footprints, all still here, all still speaking if we listen. Memory was the thread that bound the people together. In a world where storms erased footprints, where snow buried camps, where rivers shifted course, memory was the only map that endured. The long memory stretched across generations, carried in story, in ritual, in song, in the unbroken chain of words spoken around firelight. The elders were the keepers of this memory. They sat by the flames, their faces lined like the ridges of ice, their voices steady against the roar of wind. They told children where the herds once traveled, which valleys gave shelter, which rivers were treacherous. They recited myths of spirits that guided the hunt, of ancestors who walked with them still. These stories were not idle. They were survival manuals disguised as tale, wisdom hidden within wonder. Every death, every hunt, every crossing was remembered. The child who slipped into a river became a warning tale. The hunter who felled a mastodon became a song. The storm that buried a camp became a myth of spirits testing the strong. In this way, experience was never lost. It was transformed, woven into memory so that the living carried the dead with them. Archaeology reveals echoes of this process. In burial sites, beads, ochre, and ornaments are not random. They are symbols of memory, tokens linking the living to the departed. In decorated tools, etched with lines and patterns, archaeologists see not only function, but remembrance. The mark of a family, a clan, a story inscribed on stone. These artifacts whisper that memory was not abstract, but tangible, embedded into the objects people carried with them. The long memory was not only of hardship, it was also of beauty. Songs celebrated the return of the herds, the sparkle of auroras, the dance of flames in the dark. Myths grew around animals both real and vanished. Children heard of mammoths that had given themselves willingly, of wolves who guided hunters in dreams, of rivers whose spirits sang beneath ice. These stories gave meaning to the unpredictable world, shaping chaos into narrative. Even today, fragments of such memory persist. Oral traditions of indigenous peoples across the Americas contain echoes of Ice Age realities, tales of giant animals, of floods, of ancestors who crossed great distances. Though shaped and reshaped by centuries, these traditions carry the resonance of ancient truths. They are living archaeology, the long memory still spoken aloud. Genetic studies confirm what story already suggested, that memory was carried not only in words, but in blood. Ancient DNA reveals lineages stretching back to Beringia, proving that the people who crossed the land bridge left descendants scattered from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America. Their blood is a silent witness, a biological memory etched into every cell. For those who walk the Americas today, the long memory is alive within their very bodies. The people themselves understood memory as sacred. To forget was to risk death, to break the chain that linked them to survival. Children learned songs until they could repeat them without error. Rituals reinforced knowledge. Dances mimicked hunts. Chants recited migration paths. Painted symbols recalled the shapes of animals. Memory was not stored in objects alone. It was rehearsed daily, performed until it became inseparable from identity. The long memory also gave meaning to suffering. Bones in the snow, predators in the dark, hunger in the belly, all were woven into stories that transformed pain into lesson. In this way, grief was not erased, but carried, softened by retelling. The living found strength in knowing that others had endured before them, that their struggles were part of a larger journey. Archaeological finds of repeated hearths in the same valleys, spanning centuries, show how memory guided migration. Families returned again and again to familiar places, led by stories that recalled where fire once burned. These sites are proof that memory shaped movement as much as instinct did. The land itself became layered with memory. Each campsite another verse in a song that stretched across generations. The children of the long memory inherited not only survival skills, but identity. To know the stories was to know who they were, to belong to a chain that stretched back to the ancestors who first crossed the white expanse. Around the fire, when the wind howled outside, children listened, their eyes wide, their voices joining in chorus. In them, the memory lived forward, ensuring that no story was ever lost completely. The long memory was not perfect. Some stories twisted with time, others faded into silence. Yet even distorted, they carried truth. A tale of a great flood may echo real cataclysms when glacial lakes burst. A myth of giant beasts recalls encounters with mastodons and sloths. A story of spirits walking in the sky mirrors the auroras that lit their nights. Each myth, each chant, each carving preserved fragments of lived reality, refracted through imagination. For the people themselves, memory was more than utility. It was comfort. To sit by a fire, to hear the voice of an elder, to know that others had faced storms, hunger, and predators, and survived, was to find courage for tomorrow. Memory was warmth, a flame carried across time, as surely as fire was carried from camp to camp. And so, the long memory grew, stretching ever farther as families moved deeper into the Americas. With each new valley, each new river, each new encounter, stories expanded, traditions adapted. Yet at their core, the memories of the ice, the snow, the crossing, the hunts, the grief, and the hope remained. They were the backbone of identity, the anchor of humanity in a shifting world. Even now, when archaeologists kneel in frozen soil and brush away the dust from a stone blade or a bead, they are touching memory. Not theirs, not ours, but the memory of those who lived tens of thousands of years ago. The silent witnesses of artifacts and bones become part of the long memory, connecting past and present in a single, unbroken thread. The people of the ice did not know they were writing history. They only knew that they must remember. And in that remembering, they ensured that their journey would not be forgotten, that it would echo across snow and fire, across generations, across millennia. The long memory was not merely survival, it was legacy. They had crossed. What began as a following of herds, a drift of families across a land bridge of ice and grass, had become something far greater. With every step southward, with every campfire lit in unfamiliar valleys, humanity pressed deeper into a continent no human had ever seen before. This was the New World, vast, silent, abundant, and waiting. The first generations did not think of themselves as discoverers. They thought only of survival. The rivers offered fish, the forests offered wood, the plains offered game. They moved from one resource to the next, building fires, shaping tools, weaving memory into new landscapes. But slowly, imperceptibly, their presence transformed the land. Footprints became paths. Camps became places of return. Stories rooted themselves in soil and stone. The New World was immense. To the north lay tundra, still cold, still echoing the Old World. To the south stretched forests, grasslands, deserts, mountains, and rivers larger than any they had known. Each step revealed a new environment. Each new environment demanded adaptation. Humanity fractured and flourished, spreading like water across the land, filling valleys, following coasts, climbing ridges. Archaeological evidence confirms this spread. Stone tools characteristic of Siberia appear first in Alaska, then change as they move southward. Sharper, broader, shaped to new prey. Hearths mark the advance of camps, each layer of ash a waypoint in the migration. Genetic studies of ancient remains trace the journey too, showing how small founding populations diversified, carrying fragments of Beringia into every corner of the Americas. These are the scientific echoes of what the people themselves once lived step by step. The New World gave gifts beyond measure. Herds of bison blackened the plains, vast and thundering. Elk and deer filled the forests. Rivers swarmed with salmon, seas with seals and whales. In the south, giant sloths and glyptodons still lumbered, Mastodons still crashed through woodlands. For a time, abundance seemed endless. To people long hardened by scarcity, it must have felt like a dream. But abundance did not erase danger. Storms struck, predators prowled, rivers flooded, and the giants themselves were not always prey. They were threats, capable of crushing, goring, and killing. Archaeological finds of human skeletons bearing wounds from tusks and claws remind us that the New World was no Eden, but another crucible. Survival remained costly, and blood still stained the snow and soil. Yet, for all the hardship, there was growth. Families became clans. Clans became networks, spreading along coasts, valleys, and rivers. Songs and stories multiplied, adapting to new animals, new spirits, new landscapes. The myths of the old world blended with those of the new, creating a tapestry of meaning that anchored humanity in a continent that had once been alien. The children born here became the first true heirs of the New World. Their earliest steps were not on Beringian soil, but on American ground. Their first words echoed not in the old camps, but in new ones, built beside strange rivers and mountains. To them, the land was not foreign. It was home. In their laughter and their play, the migration became memory, a story carried forward rather than a path still walked. Archaeology preserves even this transition. In some sites, footprints of children mingle with those of animals no longer alive today. Giant sloths, mammoths, mastodons. These prints are the signatures of a new generation, living not in exile, but in belonging. Forensic analysis of these remains tells us that these children grew strong, nourished by abundance, adapting quickly to climates and diets their ancestors had only just begun to learn. The New World was not empty when they arrived. It had long been shaped by climate, by animals, by the spirits of land and sky. To step into it was not conquest, but encounter. And slowly, the people wove themselves into its fabric. They learned to follow the salmon runs, to shape canoes, to build shelters from wood and bark, to craft tools suited to local stone. Each environment drew forth new skills, new identities, new traditions. In time, these small beginnings became the roots of vast diversity. The peoples of the Americas would spread from the Arctic tundra to the rainforests of the Amazon, from the Great Plains to the Andes. They would shape languages, myths, and cultures as varied as the landscapes they inhabited. But all of it began here, with the first footsteps across the land bridge, with the first fires lit beneath unfamiliar stars. The forensic record of bones, tools, and DNA confirms the scale of this transformation. Ancient genomes show how a small group of migrants became the ancestors of millions. Stone tools scattered across both continents show adaptation and innovation. Hearths layered in caves and riverbanks tell of repeated return, of places made sacred by use. These traces are the silent witnesses of the greatest migration humanity has ever undertaken. But for the people themselves, it was simpler. It was the warmth of fire after a storm, the taste of fresh fish pulled from a river, the laughter of children chasing each other through new forests, the grief of burying kin beneath strange soil, red ochre staining the earth of a new land, the relief of finding shelter, the terror of hearing predators in the night, the awe of seeing mountains rise where none had stood before. For them, the New World was not concept, but lived reality. Fragile, immediate, real. They did not know they were writing history. They did not know that thousands of years later, their bones, tools, and ashes would be studied by strangers trying to piece together their lives. They did not know that their descendants would stretch across two continents, building civilizations, carrying languages, remembering myths of the crossing and fragments of story. They only knew that they must survive, that the land ahead was both challenge and promise, and survive they did. They carried fire and memory, skill and courage into every corner of the New World. They endured storms, hunted giants, learned rivers, and told stories. In doing so, they ensured that humanity's journey did not end at the edge of the known world, but expanded into one that stretched from pole to pole. The New World was not simply discovered, it was entered, embraced, and made home. And in that act, humanity itself was transformed. The bones in the snow, the tools in the soil, the footprints in mud, all tell us the same truth. That fragile families crossing a frozen bridge carried within them the strength to reshape continents. Their fire still burns in the long memory of their descendants. Their journey still echoes in every story told of beginnings. Their presence still lingers in the land itself, in rivers and valleys, in soil and stone. The New World was not the end of their migration. It was the beginning of everything that followed.